Hello, everybody. You are listening to Through Time and Clades. My name is Albert,
And I'm Joan.
and so today we have a, special episode, I suppose you could say. So this is the first updates special episode for my series Dinosaurs, the second chapter, which is about bird evolution. Um, because there have been various new discoveries that have come out during and after the time that we were producing this series, and so there has been some information that needs to be updated relative to what I already said in those episodes that we recorded. And so this is going to be an episode about some of the major new discoveries that have happened since then that will either change or supplement some subjects that I discussed in the series. So yeah, that's certainly looking forward to going over those. Science is of course always changing, and it's very exciting to keep up with it, um, or at least try to. But before we dive in, it's been a while since we last recorded. So how have you been doing?
I've been doing fairly well. Earlier this week, I came back from a week-long field trip in Maine to see family, and it was a really wonderful time. My uncle had a big lake house that he let us stay in.
Mm.
Camp What Are the Chances, as he called it. He's quite a jokey kind of guy that we really love. Um, oh, it was just really nice. If I had mentioned in the previous episode that we recorded, it had been 3 years since I'd been to Maine, since the passing of my grandmother on my father's side.
Mm.
And, there were a lot of things that were the same, and there were quite a few that were very, very different. And that's always a lot to kind of come to grips with emotionally.
Mm.
But I think overall the experience was very positive and very enjoyable. And it's always too short, these sorts of vacations. You wish you could stay longer and longer. And usually our main vacations are like 2-week adventures, but we only had 1 week to spare because that's what Dad's work could give him. But I think we made the most of it, and I was very, very pleased with things. And so otherwise, I mean, I've been doing fairly well. Albert, I understand you're nearing the edge of your thesis closer and closer every day.
Yeah, I suppose you could say that. Yes. So yeah, I guess that would be my big update in terms of my kind of personal or academic life. Um, yeah. So I have actually completed that final chapter of my thesis um, that I've been, mentioning for many, many episodes um, in this series for a long time. And yeah, so I finally completed a draft of it that I have sent off to my supervisor. And so he'll leave some comments on it. And then when that's done, I can kind of include it in my overall thesis and hopefully finally submit that. So I'm still quite busy despite finishing that step. There are a few other things I need to do for my thesis to be considered finished and ready to be submitted. Not just waiting for the comments from my supervisor, but also I have to write like an overall introduction, kind of introducing all of the chapters together, and then an overall conclusion that's doing much the same thing except it's a conclusion, um, and a few other things similar to that. And I've also been applying to various postdoctoral positions and grants and such. So hopefully I can continue doing science after I get my PhD. Um, but we'll see how that goes. So yeah, lots of things still. Uh, I'm still busy with, but yeah, I definitely am relieved to be done with that final chapter. That really was the kind of the last really big thing I had to do before I can submit my thesis. So yeah, that's a big weight off my back. I'm happy about that.
Excellent. And hey, listen, congratulations on the beautiful Kurzgesagt calendar that just came out last week.
Yeah. That's right. We haven't talked about that yet on the show. That's right. Yes. So, yeah, a couple of other things that I've consulted on for the German educational studio Kurzgesagt have been released in the meantime since we last recorded. So yeah, it turns out that they've been really into paleontology this year. They specifically told me that yeah, they just kind of fell down the rabbit hole of paleontology and just are really into it right now and wanted to do a lot of different things with it. Um, so earlier this month, I believe, yeah, they released a video basically about how we figure out the appearance of extinct animals and some of the things we can figure out and some of the
Mm.
things that we can't. If you're familiar with the book All Yesterdays by C.M. Kozeman, John Conway, and Darren Naish, then yeah, that it's basically the Kurzgesagt take on that subject that's covered in that book. So yeah, I consulted on that one. Basically, they gave me the script and I made some suggestions and such, and I'm pretty happy with what they ended up doing with it. And they did indeed use a number of the resources I recommended and some of the examples I suggested that they could use. So yeah, that was pretty good. And kind of in conjunction with releasing that video, they also have started selling their new calendar, the calendar for next year, the year 2022. But in their case, they have a tradition of calling it the human era calendar. So they kind of extend the years by 10,000 years. So they call it the 12,022 calendar to represent like a broader range of human history. And in this year's calendar, they have a theme to it, and that is paleontology. So they each month has basically an illustration in the standard Kurzgesagt style, a very distinctive art style that they have, representing some time period or ecosystem in Earth's history. And featuring some of the most bizarre and interesting prehistoric species that they happen to be most interested in. And so, yeah, I also consulted on that one. That one, I haven't yet seen the final kind of product myself. I haven't actually held the calendar in my hands, but they basically showed me the images that they came up with for that calendar, and also I believe they also have some descriptive text, kind of just describing
Mm.
well what's happening in the images and some of the interesting facts about the animals that they feature. And I also went over those and made some suggestions or corrections. So yeah, that's also pretty exciting, and I did quite a bit of work on that. So yeah, it's great to see that out, and it's great to see that people seem to be really excited for it.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's sort of a holiday tradition for my folks that mom gets the Kurzgesagt calendars as
Mm,
because like they would always give us calendars every year,
yeah,
and so now that they've been doing these, um, they've been adding to that.
right.
I mean, I have loved these calendars so far. This is my second Kurzgesagt calendar at the moment
Mm,
for 12,021.
yeah.
I'm looking at the October page right now where it's the speculative future where they're using fusion
Oh,
energy.
wow.
And I mean, they're pretty calendars. Like, they're a really good size.
Hmm.
The images just pop. I mean, like, the way that they print these calendars is amazing. And yeah, I mean, your description sounds about right. I mean, they've been trying different things, but I think now they're in like a nice little cycle where they have like the perfect, you know, block to text ratio,
Mm.
make like a really aesthetically pleasing calendar. And I've just been loving them, and I'm sure I'll definitely enjoy this one for sure. Because yeah, I like that Kurzgesagt style. It's very eye-catching.
It
It's
is, yeah.
cute in a
Yep.
lot of ways, and you just can't not like it, you know.
It really
Um,
pops.
so it's kind of been fun to see them have their takes on prehistoric animals.
Hmm.
Because yeah, that video I saw it in Maine. Of course, it
Oh
came
yeah.
out. Both of these came out, while I was vacationing, which was like a huge surprise. I was not expecting it.
Mm.
Um, even though like they had like been putting the little countdown things on their social
Oh
media,
right,
which I
yeah.
presume was for a video, but part of my head was like, is this the calendar? Is it coming? And sure enough, it was. And it's like, oh, great. Um, also, that's been exciting. Honestly, in terms of like exciting things that have been coming out, we also have had our newest episode of the Dinosaurs series.
That's
Um,
right.
I know we reviewed the last one in a previous recording, um, but this was Our Frozen Past,
Yeah. Mm.
and now I haven't looked like too deeply into like the behind the scenes for this yet. I've been focused on other things, but I believe um, the characters are troodontids,
Yeah.
and they're living out in like northern Canada, and it's a very very interesting little story.
Mm-hmm.
Without giving too much away, they take some like modern animal behaviors and kind of play with them in an
Yeah.
interesting
Mm-hmm.
way. It's like a really dramatic story, but then it has more or less a happy ending,
Yeah. Mm.
or maybe bittersweet depending on how you look
Sure.
at it.
Yeah.
But I really enjoyed it, and I'm sure Albert, you got the chance to catch it too.
Yes, I did. I did watch it. It's definitely a beautiful animation, and very interesting in terms of the story. Um, yeah, it's definitely very. There are elements of it that are very speculative, and if you watch the behind the scenes video, the creator does say, yeah, it's speculative and that's intentional. Um, so, like we kind of mentioned before when we talked about the Dinosaurs series, it is not intended to be a documentary series. It is meant to be more an exercise in storytelling, and but in doing that, it definitely does that very well. And certainly, I do think that the depictions of the animals um, are at least plausible. Like they may or may not be like the most likely options in terms of some of the design choices, but you can't say that they are wrong, objectively. So yeah, no, I definitely been enjoying this series so far. Um,
Yeah, and it's massive massive props to everybody involved. I mean, it's been really exciting so far, especially as like a one man project,
right? Yeah.
and like the marketing I've seen. I mean, it's been mostly word of mouth.
Hmm.
I've noticed.
That's true. Yeah.
It's kind of like how I learned that an episode's been released because everyone's talking about it. It's like, oh, I have to go check it out. Um, but it's just great. And another exciting news. So on the 19th of this month, David Wengrove's and the late David Graeber's Dawn of Everything has been released in the United Kingdom to much fanfare. And I mean, I've been excited for this for quite a long time now. And so my copy is currently making its way across the Atlantic as we speak. And I should be receiving my copy soon. And of course, for those of you who aren't familiar or haven't kept up with our previous discussions of it, especially from the last update special for Humanity Prologue, The Dawn of Everything is basically a huge, landmark, groundbreaking work that seeks to kind of reinterpret the prehistory of humanity by sort of looking back at like old research and earlier philosophical debates during the age of European expansion to kind of really bring back agency to peoples who lived in prehistory.
Mm,
There's often been an assumption that they were kind of at the mercy of nature and they were restricted to these small communities, wandering around the landscape looking for food. And then only until like the last 10 or 12,000 years or so, suddenly, they had agriculture in cities and they were engaging in politics for the first time and economics and religion, and things were more complex from there. When in reality, when we look at the vast swath of evidence, that does not seem to be the case
mm,
at all. And probably a lot of our assumptions about human prehistory are not only really wrong, but like actually rooted in a history of very terrible ideas
mm.
about humanity.
Yeah.
And this has been kind of a long time coming. I mean, there has certainly been many researchers who have poked and prodded at those earlier models before, some going back all the way to like the 80s and 70s and so forth. But now, like, all these different fields are coming to a head, and I think from here on out, things are going to be very, very interesting for anthropology. So I will certainly be, devouring the dawn of everything as much as I can, and I don't know, maybe I'll do a small episode about it.
Hmm. Hmm.
I think that might be interesting. There's a there's been a lot of talk about the book, and I'd certainly love to throw my 2 cents as well, considering that I've been schooling in anthropology for quite a while now.
Hmm. Hmm.
Like there's a mailing list out now, which is kind of exciting.
Hmm.
anthropologists and others are going to get together and discuss the ideas of the book. And gosh, the next decade or so is going to be very interesting for the field. So I definitely can't wait. And as far as like one last sort of announcement, this is sort of a small thing, probably very niche, but if anybody's interested, I am happy to provide this for you. So back in the late 1980s, Douglas Oliver, who is an anthropologist who's done a lot of work in the Pacific Islands, he released a 2-volume book called Oceania, The Native Cultures of Australia and the Pacific Islands. And it's this very huge, essentially encyclopedic look at the anthropological history of Australia and the Pacific Islands. It's very dense. It starts with like the geologic history and sort of the evolutionary history of the hominins who lived in that region. And then it goes into sort of like the social aspects of their lives, activities, subsistence patterns. It's very, very rich with information, and it's been a great resource for a number of years. It's by the University of Hawaii Press, and this is a book, a volume set that I've been sort of had my eye on for many years. I found it at a university library, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is great. But of course, being such an older, more technical book, it tends to be a little bit on the pricey side of things. So imagine my surprise when one day I'm just looking around to see what I can find on it, and University of Hawaii Press itself has the books right now on sale from $97. They've marked it down all the way to $5.
Wow.
And I was like, holy shit, like finally. So I
Right.
wasted no time. And I went and I got it, and I have them here with me right now, and oh, they are beautiful. They are fantastic books. I've already like read a little bit of sections here and there, and it's really fun. They even, and this is actually kind of fun. We talked about cassowary rearing in New
Right.
Guinea
Yeah.
on our last news episode, and how I mentioned like there's ethnographic records of this happening on New Guinea. And sure enough, in the book, they do talk about it. But of course, now we have the deep time perspective to that with this recent work that we know it's been going on for at least 20,000 years or so. So, things like that have just been really, really great.
Yeah.
Now, I guess as far as like, if you, the viewer, would like to purchase a volume set for yourself, I guess you would have to look at like what the shipping costs and info is for your region of the world. Of course, I live in the United States, and Hawaii is technically, it's the United States
Right.
as well. So my shipping was only maybe $3 extra to have it shipped all the way from Honolulu to
Wow.
North Carolina. But if you live in the UK or Denmark or wherever, that might be different for you.
Yeah.
So definitely do check with that if you get the chance. But gosh, I don't know when a series like this will be so cheap and available, in the near future. So if you want the chance to take a look, we will be sure to post the link in the description, as well as links to everything that we've talked about here. And yeah, if you want to read up on your Pacific anthropology, this is a good first start, especially if you like big, thick books like I do. So yeah, that's basically it for announcements on my end. Do you have anything else you'd like to kind of throw in?
Not in particular. I think, yeah, I think those are probably my big announcements, the stuff that we've already talked about. Um, but yeah, I will say that, with my final chapter done, I should eventually be getting around to focusing on doing some work for our website. But like I said, I do still have other things I need to take care of. So yeah, don't hold your breath for it. But yes, I do intend to get around to that as soon as I possibly can. Yep.
Oh yeah, and the same here too. It's we've been taking a breather on the site, but it's still being worked on. We have your word. It'll just be a little while.
Right.
We
Yeah.
can't say anything definitive about when it's gonna launch just yet.
No, no, yeah, we're still quite far from that point. But yeah, we have been thinking about it, and we have been working on it when possible. But yes, yeah, still on our minds. That's for sure.
Yeah.
All right. But I guess if that's it for our general announcements, yeah, I guess we can start going through our updates for Dinosaurs, the second chapter. What do you think?
Woohoo! Let's do it.
Alrighty then. Let's continue on to the next slide. Um, and so I didn't have much that I didn't notice much that I had to update for the first episode. So the episode just introducing crown birds and looking at their origins. Um, I didn't notice many major studies that would change what I said in that episode. So I don't have anything for that. But if we go on to episode 2, where we introduce the paleognathe birds, so the ostriches and emus and their close relatives, so a lot of the large flightless birds, including some recently extinct forms like the moa and the elephant birds. And today there is still one flying group of paleognathe birds, the tinamous of South America. So um, they form kind of the closest living relatives to all other living birds today. So basically, the deepest split between all modern type birds or crown birds is between the paleognaths and all the other birds. The other birds are the neonates. But of course, you know all of that if you've watched through our episodes. And so there are a couple studies that have come out in the past year or so that update our knowledge of paleognathe evolution or have implications for them. Uh, so I'll talk about them here. And so first up is actually a study that we have discussed before on the show. It's just not in Dinosaurs: The Second Chapter. It didn't come out early enough for the paleognathe episode of the Dinosaurs series, but we actually did cover this study in our start of the year kind of look back at 2020 that we did at the very beginning of 2021, if you remember that. So this is a study on paleognaths, but they also looked at other birds as well for comparative purposes. And what they were looking at is basically the fact that paleognaths today have this organ, this sensitive organ inside the bill. And this is actually really curious because there is actually only one group of living paleognaths that seem to really use this organ to do anything, and that is the kiwi. The kiwi of New Zealand have used their very sensitive bill to kind of probe into the soil to look for prey, and they are able to use their bill to detect kind of the vibrations of prey moving through the ground, like even without directly touching the prey item itself. And so it seems that this kind of bill tip organ is helpful for doing that. But other paleognaths also have this organ, but they do not feed in this manner, and so it has kind of been an open question as to why they have it in the first place. And so this study kind of what they did was they first looked at whether or not we can tell a bird has such an organ from their skeleton, and specifically look at the kind of bill tip of various different kinds of birds, including all kinds of paleognaths. And they found that birds that have such an organ tend to have like these very densely distributed like pits on the end of their beak, and you can see that in the two top images here. So that's a kiwi and a tinamou, which both have these very densely distributed pits, whereas birds that do not have such an organ don't have this kind of distribution of these pits on the end of the snout. They'll have some pits, but they will be more sparsely distributed. And this is true not only for paleognaths, but also in neonates as well, because there are also a few neonate groups that have evolved such an organ. So groups like the sandpipers and the ibises also kind of are able to feed in a very similar manner, and they also have this kind of bill tip organ that allows them to use this remote touch reception to find their prey. And so they found that consistently birds that have this bill tip organ all have this kind of distribution of the pits at the end of their beak. So with that being kind of verified in modern birds, the researchers then looked at some fossil birds, and in this case they looked at the lithoronithids. And if you don't remember lithoronithids are a group of we currently think they're probably some sort of paleognate bird, although there are some people who have suggested that maybe they're not even crown birds at all, but just kind of closely related to crown birds and blah blah blah. But in general, most of the recent studies that have been done on their phylogeny suggest that they are a group of paleognates, and in fact they are most likely stem paleognates, so they're outside of the group containing all living paleognates, but they are more closely related to paleognates than to any living group, than to any other living group, that is. So what they found was is shown on the kind of the bottom two images here are two different paleognate skulls. And at the end of the beak, they found that lithoornithids actually have a very similar kind of distribution of pits to birds that have this kind of bill tip organ. And I should add also that lithoornithids were a flying group of birds. So they were not like the giant kind of flightless paleognates today. So they were flight capable. They were much smaller. And it has long been thought, actually, that since they have these relatively long and slender bills, that they might have fed by kind of probing for food in the soil or in the sand and such. And it seems that this finding would seem to support that. They have this distribution of pits that are consistent with having a bill tip organ that would facilitate this kind of behavior. And furthermore, if lithoornithids are stem paleognates, then this might be a hint as to why we see this structure in all kinds of living paleognates, not just the ones that feed by probing. And it may be that ancestrally all paleognates kind of descended from an ancestor with this kind of bill tip organ, so something similar to a lithoornithids. And probably lived in a similar manner to a lithoornithid and was using this organ to probe for food in the soil. But in the modern day, it seems that most groups of paleognates have kind of moved away from that kind of ecology and started doing different things, but all of them still retain that bill tip organ and this characteristic of having these densely distributed pits in the beak. So yeah, that was a pretty cool study. It tells us something about how lithoornithids might have lived, and it also tells us something potentially about the origins of modern paleognates. So that was pretty cool. Do you have anything to add?
No, that was pretty fascinating as well. I do have very vague memories of us talking about this on that big 2020 special. But then again, we talked about a lot of things.
Yeah, we covered a lot in that episode, so no, I don't expect anyone to remember everything we discussed. That's for sure.
No, this is really fascinating. Definitely, like whatever light we can shed on these very early paleognates, I think will, help unravel other mysteries of the evolution of this group.
Yep, totally. All right, so let's go on to the next slide. So I'm going to do something interesting with this one. So this is a really big discovery in by the standards of like our field. In fact, I would consider this one of the biggest kind of discoveries of the past year related to kind of crown bird paleontology. However, even though this is a very, very relevant study to paleognates, I actually will be covering this study later this episode. So I'll be covering the study in the episode, or in the part of this episode where we update episode 6 of Dinosaurs, the second chapter, instead of here. And the reasons for that will become clear when we get there. But yeah, if you want to find out more about the story, skip to the part where we start talking about episode 6, and there will be a timestamp in the description as always, so you can skip over there if you want. But yes, a preview for a bit later. But yeah, this is a very cool study, but we'll get there. All right, well, with that in mind, let's continue onward to the next slide. So this is an update for the third episode. So this is the episode where we met galloanserans, the group that unites chickens and ducks, and we also started introducing the neonate birds in that episode. And so this new study was done on a new specimen of a Cretaceous bird-like dinosaur called Ichthyornis. And so Ichthyornis was not a crown bird. but it was pretty much as close as you can get to being a crown bird without actually being one. So it was one of the closest relatives we know of in the fossil record to crown birds. And in many ways, it probably kind of approximates perhaps an ancestral kind of condition that crown birds might have evolved from. Um, and so the reason I'm talking about this stem bird here in an episode about neonathous crown birds is because of the fact that this specimen sheds some light on a very characteristic feature that has traditionally been used to kind of distinguish different groups of crown birds, and people have kind of based certain evolutionary assumptions around that feature, and that is in fact the feature that gave the groups paleognaths and neonates their name. So paleognaths means ancient jaws, whereas neonates means new jaws. And we talked about this in the series, why they are called this, and the kind of the differences between the kind of neonate jaw versus the paleonate jaw. But to review, kind of some of the main differences you see in these two different groups of crown birds is the anatomy of their palate. So in the palate of crown birds, there are, well, in this case, we are looking at two main bones called the pterygoid and the palatine. So if you look at the figure on the right here, the pterygoids are colored in orange on these various bird skulls, and the palatines are colored in purple. And so in paleonate birds, the palatines and the pterygoids are fused to each other. And so there isn't any kind of joint between them. Now, because these bones are quite thin in a paleonate palate, the bones are actually still able to bend up and down, but there's no like actual kind of separated joint there. And on the kind of bottom here, the E and F in a rhea, which is a paleonate, you can see that condition represented. The pterygoid and the palatine are kind of closely attached to one another and don't have a mobile joint in between. Whereas in a neonate bird, the pterygoid and the palatine have a joint in between them, and so there's actually a joint that allows the upper jaw to kind of flex up and down, and that is represented in C and D, in this case a grebe, showing the palatine and pterygoid kind of having a joint between them. Okay, well, technically it's a bit more complex than that. So you notice that there's this teal region in the figure here, and so what's actually going on is that the pterygoid is split into two halves, and so the front half gets fused to the palatine in an adult neonate, but retains kind of a mobile joint with the back half of the pterygoid. But usually when we explain this, we usually call the entire kind of front half of the pterygoid plus the palatine as just the palatine. And so, yeah, there we go. But in any case, you can see that there's this mobile joint in the palate, which is characteristic of neonatus birds. And the reason that we call the paleonates the ancient jaws and the neonates the new jaws is because traditionally it has been assumed that the paleonate condition is the ancestral condition, that it was kind of retained from ancestors that weren't crown birds, whereas the neonate condition is kind of a new condition that was evolved within the neonates. But the truth is that there wasn't actually a lot of fossil evidence we could turn to kind of confirm this, because well-preserved palates of like these stem birds that are closely related to crown birds are very rare. But this new specimen of Ichthyornis, which consists of this lovely skull, you can see that on the left here is most of the skull is preserved on one slab, and then the letter C shows like the tip of the snout is preserved on a different slab. But yeah, if you put them together, you get kind of a pretty nice, nearly complete, not quite, but nearly complete skull. And it turns out this specimen tells us a number of things, but in some ways, I think the most interesting thing is that it has a well-preserved palate, and it does not have the pterygoids, which is why on the right there, the pterygoids are represented in kind of a dotted outline, but it does preserve the palatines and the palatines and the front half of the pterygoids, and the front half of the pterygoids are also called the hemipterygoids in this case when they're separated from the back half. And so it turns out that the hemipterygoid and the palatine of Ichthyornis has the region in the back, in the tip of it, the back tip of it, looks like it's for a mobile joint and not kind of a fused condition with the back half of the pterygoid. So what this shows is that Ichthyornis was not a neonate; it was not a member of the neonate clade, but it had a neonate-like palate. And if Ichthyornis had a neonate-like palate, then that raises the possibility that the neonate palate is in fact the ancestral condition for crowned birds and not the new version that was evolved later within the kind of neonate clade. So that is extremely interesting and very cool that we finally have fossil evidence that actually tells us something about this, and that it is, it's kind of counterintuitive to what was traditionally thought. So that is very interesting, and I look forward to kind of hopefully more findings that can further shed light on the evolution of this structure in other fossil birds, hopefully. Now, there is one more thing about this study that I'm kind of obligated to comment on, and people have asked me about it. So they basically included this new information about Ichthyornis into a phylogenetic analysis. And in their phylogenetic analysis, they find that Asteriornis, Asteriornis is one of the oldest known crown birds. It's from the late Cretaceous, and it is known from a nearly complete skull and some other fragmentary bones. Now, I was on the team that helped describe Asteriornis, and I've mentioned it kind of multiple times during the Dinosaurs, the second chapter series. But in our study, we thought, and we explained why we thought that it is most likely closely related to galloanserans, the chicken and duck group, and probably represents a very early member of that lineage. Now, in this new study, these authors, in their phylogenetic analysis, after they included kind of the new information from Ichthyornis, in their analysis, they recovered Asteriornis as a stem paleonate instead of a stem galloanseran or any other kind of member of the total group of galloanseri. So people have asked me, well, what do you think about this? Like, do you think Asteriornis could be a stem paleonate instead? The short answer I'll give is probably not, and there are a few reasons for this. We are still in the process of doing other studies on Asteriornis, so I'm not going to kind of give away a lot of our findings or anything. But I do think that the evidence for considering it a stem paleonate are not that strong. And first of all, for the record, I don't think the kind of neonate palate in Ichthyornis really affected that result in their study, because the palate of Asteriornis, even though it has a nearly complete skull, is not very well preserved. So you can't really take into consideration any characters, any anatomical features from that region of Asteriornis anyway. So I don't think that is a reason they found it as a stem paleonate. Now, a couple of reasons that I don't think that the evidence for it being a stem paleonate is particularly strong is, first of all, the data set that they used in this study for the phylogenetic analysis was not intended to look at relationships within crown birds. It's actually a data set that was intended to look at relationships of stem birds that are closely related to crown birds but are not like actually within the crown itself. And so they do include a few crown birds in this analysis, just to have them there and let the analysis know that, okay, these are the crown birds and these are features that characterize crown birds. But it's not really made for kind of distinguishing between different lineages of crown birds in very fine detail. like so it doesn't include like all the relevant characters for that. It doesn't include many of the relevant species for that. It only has a handful of modern bird species in there. So if you include a taxon, if you include a species in a phylogenetic analysis that is not really made for kind of figuring out where it goes, then it's not that unusual. You might find it in a strange place that's kind of unexpected. So yeah, that's one reason why I don't think the evidence for it being a stem paleognathe is especially strong. And secondly, in the paper itself, the researchers actually do mention that it doesn't take very much for them to move Asteriornis to a galloanseran position in their using their data set basically. So it only takes what we call one step. So it like basically what this means is that based on the characters, based on the anatomical features that they included in their study, it only takes like one more change. Like if we assume that Asteriornis is a galloanseran, it only takes one more change compared in the evolutionary history compared to if they found it as a stem paleognathe. And like one change is like not very much at all. Like if you add a single new anatomical feature into that analysis, it could like add a bunch of changes into that step count. So yeah, it is not really a significant kind of change. So what they really found in their analysis is that their analysis actually doesn't really strongly support Asteriornis as a stem paleognathe over being a member of Galloanserae. Like that's like those two possibilities are like almost equally well supported in their study. And like I said, they don't include all the relevant characters for like crowned birds, and so that if they did add more, then it's possible that they could find more support for one or the other. So anyway, yeah, that's kind of my spiel on their finding that Asteriornis is a stem paleognathe. Is that personally, I don't think the evidence is very strong. I do think this is a very cool study. It tells us lots of interesting things, especially about Ichthyornis and the origins of crowned birds. But yeah, I would not take the I would not bet money on what they found regarding Asteriornis, the position of Asteriornis. So yeah, do you have anything to add about this study?
So, do you think, like, with more research and perhaps more specimens that might show this mobile palette, do you
Hmm.
think there'll be like a serious consideration to flip the names of Paleognathae and Neognathae to better reflect this information?
you know, I guess I could see someone bringing it up about changing the names, but I don't think it's very likely that we'll follow through with that because, yeah, I mean these names have been associated with the specific groups that they have for so long. Um, yeah, I don't think it's very likely that we're going to just up and change and flip it around and just cause confusion for future scholars or anything. It, like we know when we name things in biology that names can end up being misleading. Like some assumption that we made while creating the names might turn out to be wrong. But in the interest of stability, we don't usually change names just for that reason. Yeah, so I don't think it is very likely that we will end up calling paleonates neonates and vice versa in the future. But yeah, I could see someone bringing that up as maybe a joke or perhaps someone who is not familiar with the field just saying, hey, so why don't we do that? But yeah, no, I in terms of like the actual researchers and academics, yeah, probably not.
Oh, I hear that. No, I wouldn't think so either. Because I can understand how frustrating that can be.
Mhm.
Um, I do. It makes me think about the study that just came out that Darren Naish had been a part of about why we shouldn't use a Tartiodactyla
Oh,
just
right.
because we know that whales are artiodactyls.
Mhm.
So we don't need to throw all these new names to confuse folks.
Yeah. Quite true. All right, so let's continue on to the next study then. All right, the next study is somewhat smaller in scope in terms of implications for kind of the evolution of birds, but I thought it was interesting because in the Gallo and Siren episode, I did mention this extinct duck called Chendites. And Chendites is quite a recent extinction. Like it survived into the Holocene, and it was this flightless marine duck that lived on the west coast of North America during the Pleistocene and the Holocene. And even though it was a diving duck, so like it would dive under the water to look for food. It was actually not closely related to the modern group of kind of sea ducks that we have, like things like the mergansers, that are diving specialists that are often found in marine environments. But despite these similarities, Chendites was not a member of that group. It was actually more closely related to the dabbling duck group. So kind of the ducks that we might be more familiar with, like the domestic ducks and wild mallards and such, where they mostly feed by kind of swimming on the water surface and kind of upending themselves and ducking down into the water. And those ducks are able to dive, but they primarily use diving as a means of escaping predators. So they don't usually dive while foraging. So you don't really see them do it as often. But Chendites, despite being a diving forager that lived in a marine environment, it was actually more closely related to the dabbling ducks. When this is based on kind of like genetic evidence that has been recovered from its subfossil remains, because it's such a recent kind of extinction. Basically, what this new study did was it kind of investigated basically a number of things. So it investigated why Chendites might have gone extinct, and also whether its extinction kind of created any notable changes, kind of affected its ecosystem in notable ways. And what they found was, I thought, quite interesting. And this study, I think, will be of probably notable interest to you, because what they did was they looked at archaeological sites, and looked at the remains of animals that were found there, because it seems that Chendites was sometimes hunted by humans living in North America at the time, and its remains can be found at various archaeological sites in the region. And so, in addition to Chendites, they also looked at the abundance of other animals that were found at those archaeological sites, including sea otters, which is kind of marked in the middle in orange here, and also abalone, these large sea snails. And so, what this chart is showing is abundance over time, and the more recent, times are towards the left here, and deep into the past is towards the right over here. And so you can see how the abundance of these different species at archaeological sites changed over time. So, of course, Chendites eventually ended up going extinct, and so you can see at the recent end of things, it's not around very much at all towards the recent times, whereas it was more abundant in the past. And there's actually a section of this figure that did not include here, because it would make the figure too small to read on the slide. But they also tried to correlate these changes in abundance of these animals with the abundance of archaeological sites themselves, and also with kind of climate changes that were happening at the time. And what they found was that the decrease in abundance of Chendites does seem to have correlated with a time period when kind of the climate seemed to have been less stable. And so they suggest that it was likely that climate change affected, kind of the abundance of Chendites and caused it to decrease in population. But at the same time, there is also evidence that archaeological sites were getting more abundant during that time as well, and so probably human populations were expanding during this time period, and so they suggested that this was consistent with kind of human hunting and climate change both contributing to the extinction of Chendites, which is, of course, quite interesting because, as we've discussed many times on this podcast before, the cause of a lot of these kind of late Pleistocene, early Holocene extinctions, and whether or not humans had any part in them is heavily debated.
Mm.
Yeah. So that's something that they found regarding kind of patterns, whether or not the extinction of Chendites and the decline of Chendites relate to any notable patterns that have been correlated with or suggested to correlate with extinction in these animals. Um, but also, the next thing they did was they looked at isotopes in the bones of Chendites. So they essentially the chemical composition to try and figure out what Chendites might have been eating and whether or not it was eating the same things as other kinds of animals in its environment. And what they found was that Chendites was likely feeding on it was probably feeding on marine invertebrates, so things like snails and clams and such, but also on fish as well. So that's quite interesting. And it turns out that its diet probably overlapped with the diet of sea otters and I think harbor seals. So it was in some ways it was partly competing with those other species, although not they weren't eating like their diet weren't completely overlapping. So they did eat some different things as well, but in some cases they were feeding on similar food resources. And so that is interesting because what they found was that as Chendites started to decline in abundance, we see an increase in sea otter populations over time as this happened. And what's more, we see a decline in these red abalone. So what's going on here? Well, it is possible that without the competition of Chendites, the sea otters started to increase in population. And now red abalone is a species that is of sea snail that is relatively large, and it doesn't seem that Chendites would have fed on it very often. Um, yeah, it probably couldn't swallow these red abalones. They probably were feeding on smaller types of sea snails instead. However, sea otters do like to eat red abalone quite a lot, and they are able to get open these snails by smashing them in the distinctive sea otter-like manner using rocks, using tools, which is a pretty cool kind of behavior that sea otters have. And so it seems that with the increase in population of sea otters, that in turn kind of affected the population of red abalone, and red abalone started to decline in population probably because of increased predation pressure from the sea otter. So the extinction of this one type of duck started having these kind of overarching ripple effects on its ecosystem. And so I think it is really cool that we were able to detect this kind of effect in the fossil record. Do you have anything to add?
Well, this is really fascinating. Do we know sort of when Chendites started petering out as far as like extinction is concerned?
Yeah, the record at for this time period is pretty fine. But I would have to look up the paper again to give you the exact age.
Gotcha, gotcha. Because I was just thinking, I mean, the classic Pacific Northwest cultures
Mm,
began around 5,500 years ago, and of course, as we've discussed in Humanity: A Prologue, I mean, like they were very, very good at exploiting
right.
a large amount of marine resources at a very quick period of time. You know, whether it was salmon runs or digging for mollusks. So that's really fascinating to think about. I would love to kind of dig into the literature a little bit of the Pacific Northwest nations to kind of
Mm,
see if they had any records on Chendites.
yeah.
Because I know our friend Alari had messaged me about New Caledonia, an
Mm,
island in the Southwest Pacific, and how the native people there seem to have been very familiar with Sylviornis to the
right.
point
That's
where
right.
they had incorporated it into a number of um, their cultural folklore, if you will.
Yeah.
It was a sacred animal. To kill it and eat it was essentially a crime,
Hmm.
um, and it was really revered because it had a bad temper,
Yeah, that's right.
and the bill, the casque on the bill was like a status symbol that was used among sort of the headmen of the group.
Mm,
Um, so like the fact that we have like that information, like these cultural memories preserved in the literature about this extinct bird, it'd
right.
be fascinating to see if we have similar things for Chendites among the Pacific Northwest nations. Because I guess, I mean, um, Do you know like the range of Chendites? Like, was it all the way along the Pacific coast, or was it in sort of like little pockets here and there of the estuaries?
It has primarily been found in California. So yeah, it's kind of in the southwestern part of the North America. Yeah.
Oh, interesting. So kind of like towards the border end of that culture area.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Yeah. Wow. This is actually giving me a lot to actually look into. Fascinating stuff.
Yeah, yeah. Like I would really be interested to find out if there are any kind of surviving, cultural legends or myths about the species. Yeah, so I actually was just able to pull up the paper, and so they found that Chendites was probably starting to decline between 8,000 and 6,000 years ago, um, but
Oh,
it went extinct around 2,500 years ago before present. So that's kind of the timeline we're looking at.
very interesting. Alrighty. Yeah. Thank you for that. Okay. Yeah. Give me a lot to look into.
Yeah. All right, so let's continue onward. So the next study is about a very unusual group of galloanserans. Of course, Chendites was pretty unusual too, but yeah, this is a group that is not obviously similar to any of the living galloanserans, and these are the dromornithids. The dromornithids were a group of large flightless galloanserans from Australia, and they survived all the way into the Pleistocene. So, yeah, they actually were encountered by kind of early humans that arrived in Australia. There are cave paintings of kind of the latest surviving dromornithids. These birds were in some cases massive. They were probably some of the largest birds, crown birds ever to have lived. And many of them had these extremely large bills. They were quite intimidating looking. Some people used to consider them possibly carnivorous because these just looked so big and scary that it must have been killing things with those bills. But it is currently thought more likely that they were a herbivorous group, primarily using those beaks perhaps to snap up foliage and such instead. But yeah, nonetheless, they must have been very impressive to look at in life. And so there was this new study that looked at the brain structure of these dromornithids. So because we have a number of fairly well preserved dromornithid skulls, the researchers were able to kind of scan these skulls and then use the inside, the kind of brain cavity, to reconstruct what the brain of these dromornithids might have looked like and compare them to living birds. And so on the leftmost side here is one of these reconstructed brains of one of these dromornithids. It's in this case one of the species of Dromornis itself, from the Miocene of Australia. Um, and I'll be honest, brain anatomy is pretty scary, and so I in all honesty, yeah, I'm not the best person who is most qualified to talk about like all the different kind of intricacies of what they found, but I will highlight a few things here, and that is, first of all, they found that in some aspects of the brain structure of dromornithids, they seem to have been more similar to galliform birds, so the chicken-like birds, than to the duck-like birds, the anseriforms. And so on this slide here, in the middle is a horned screamer, which is an anseriform, a duck-like bird, and on the rightmost side here is a mollyfowl, which is a kind of a megapode, which are galliforms. They are chicken-like birds, which today are found in Australia and some of the surrounding islands. And in some ways, it turns out that the dromornithid brain seems to have been more similar to galliforms than to anseriforms. Notably, kind of the structure of some of the nerves you can see poking out near the bottom of the brain here. So, like, they're labeled like in Roman numeral 5 and such. The structure of those nerves themselves and the way they're oriented is more similar to galliforms in dromornithids than to the anseriform condition. Also, just to help you orient yourself, we're looking at these brains kind of from the front, but also they're also slightly angled so we can see kind of the underside of the brain as well. So you can see that each of these brains has this pair of kind of nerves coming out in front of them, kind of poking out towards you. So those are the nerves, the olfactory nerves. So they're the nerves that lead to kind of the nose region, and kind of pick up stimuli being picked up by the nose. Um, and so yeah, so the front of the brain is pointed at us in these figures. Something else that's more galliform-like in the dromarnithid brain is you can see that the top part, you know how it's kind of bulging out on the top and it's labeled WLST. This region is called the Vost in birds, and the way that it kind of bulges forward in the dromarnithids is more similar to the galliform condition than to the anseriform one. In the anseriform condition, kind of those bulges don't reach as far forward. Now you can see that in dromarnithids, the volst is extremely large, larger than either the galliforms or the anseriform condition. But in terms of its overall kind of form, it seems to be more similar to galliforms than to anseriforms. And if you recall from our episode, we're actually not quite sure how dromarnithids relate to modern galloanserans. It has been quite a popular hypothesis to suggest that they were more closely related to anseriforms, and that is one of the reasons why they have a nickname, the Demon Ducks of Doom, which is an amazing nickname. However, there have been some recent studies that suggest that maybe they are closer to galliforms instead, and it seems the authors say in this paper that probably the brain anatomy supports them being closer to galliforms. So yeah, we'll see. Yeah, of course, further studies do need to be done on that front, but it will be interesting to see how this compares to the rest of their anatomy and what we think about their relationships. And in terms of what the brain anatomy tells us about how dromarnithids lived, the very enlarged kind of Vost region is often found in birds with very good binocular vision, so very good depth perception with the eyes, both eyes kind of pointing forwards. And we actually did know this about dromarnithids just from the skull structure, that they seem to have had very good binocular vision, and so this certainly is consistent with that. And what they might have used this for, they were herbivores, so that's quite interesting because a lot of the time herbivores tend to have their eyes on the kind of sides of their head instead, and very little depth perception. So the author suggests that maybe dromarnithids were using these very good binocular vision to kind of select kind of the tastiest bits of plants to eat. They seem to have been, perhaps relatively selective, choosy feeders. Even though their beaks were very huge, their bite force doesn't seem to have been especially strong. So they were probably rather selective in their feeding, and they had quite kind of narrow from side to side beaks. So yeah, perhaps they were using their beaks to kind of selectively feed on their favorite bits of plants. And also, why they had such large bills in the first place, if it wasn't for a spectacularly strong bite, perhaps visual display is a possibility. They could have had really bright patterns on their beaks to kind of show off with. There certainly are birds today that use their beaks for that function. So yeah. Quite an interesting study. It's always quite interesting when we get to peer inside the heads of extinct organisms. Do you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, I definitely agree with the fascination there. And I also agree with like just the sheer um, fear of trying to like conquer a study like this in terms of understanding. Like I certainly do not have the qualifications to talk about this stuff either. I mean, I look at a figure like this, and my first thought is, wow, those two on the right look like Angry Birds, and then the one on the left looks
Oh.
like a Star Wars alien.
You're not wrong.
No, that is very cool. I mean, again, it kind of goes into like my whole fascination with how all these new technologies are looking at letting us look at old bones
Yep.
in new ways that, I mean, were impossible before without, I guess, destroying the original
Right,
fossil.
right.
Just fascinating stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, let's continue onwards. So I think this is the last paper I'll talk about for kind of the part three part of this episode. So this is a paper on Vegavis. We did talk about Vegavis in episode 3. This is one of the few other crown birds, or at least very few well-supported kind of crown birds that's known from the late Cretaceous. So, one is Asteriornis, and the other one that was actually discovered before it was Vegavis. And so Vegavis is known from some pretty complete material, and there are kind of two specimens that have been described that are both known from like relatively complete specimens. But kind of a problem is that the original specimen, the holotype, basically the one that the name Vegavis was given to, was embedded in like really hard rock, and so a lot of the details of the bones were actually not really visible. So kind of they the researchers who originally described it were not able to examine like every single bone from every angle that they might have wanted, and so a lot of the details could not be observed. However, in the meantime, people have been working on kind of getting those bones out of the rock. And I should add that the Vegavius was originally named in 2005, and at the time it was still embedded in those rocks, in that block of rock rather. But in the meantime, people have worked on removing it from the rock, and so the results of it were described in a new paper that came out earlier this year. So they finally removed all these bones from the type specimen, and plus not only removed the bones but also scanned them in a CT scanner. And so the pictures you're looking at on the slide here are like the scanned kind of digital models of these bones. And so this is very valuable information to have because, being one of the oldest known crown birds, Vegavis does have some implications for what we think about the evolution of crown birds and their origins, and what they were like during the Cretaceous and all of that. So this is an extremely kind of valuable study for us to have, to finally be able to get a good look at many of these bones. Now, in terms of the study itself, they describe all these bones, but like they didn't have any groundbreaking insights to make or anything like that. They did include like all the new information they found into the phylogenetic analysis, but they didn't find really anything different compared to the previous version of that analysis. So in that case they didn't really make a big impact on the results there. But nonetheless, having this information in the first place is extremely useful for future studies, because there are always bigger and bigger data sets that we can build, and new information that we can incorporate. And so for future studies that need to take Vegavis into account, this will be a good reference to turn to. And like this kind of descriptive research is very, very helpful. And, because Vegavis is one of the earliest known crown birds, known from very good material, it will be included in and it needs to be included in pretty much any study that's looking at kind of early origins of crown birds and such. So yeah, definitely, it's good to see that this material has gotten a complete description at last. And we did mention this in the episode, but just to kind of reiterate, it's not clear what kind of bird Vegavis was. Now, in the very original description in 2005, the authors of that study found that Vegavis was probably an anseriform, so a duck-like bird. But kind of newer studies have kind of put that into question. I do know that many of the original authors are still sticking to their guns that yes, this is an anseriform, but not everybody agrees about that. Some ornithologists have pointed out that there aren't actually that many features that unite Vegavis with anseriforms, and the ones that do are often convergent between birds and such. So I think most people would agree that Vegavis is likely to be a crown bird, but was it an anseriform? That is still kind of a subject of active research, and so having this additional information about it will help in those in those ongoing efforts. That's for sure. And finally, one thing I'll highlight here is that we do not yet have a complete skull of Vegavis. We have a little bit from the second specimen that was described later, especially the back half of the skull. However, we do not have a complete skull. So the illustration here, the shape of the skull, the shape of the head, is speculative. It does seem to be based on another Cretaceous bird called a polar ornis, which seems to be similar to Vegavis and is probably a close relative, and it does preserve kind of a partial skull material. So that seems to be what they based the head off here. But yeah, we don't actually know what the head of Vegavis looked like, so just so you know. And in terms of lifestyle, it seems that Vegavis was a marine bird. Probably was able to dive underwater using its feet. And in this paper, the authors did describe additional features of the hind limbs that seem to support that as well. So yeah, this was a late Cretaceous diving bird of some kind, and it seems to have been a crown bird. If it wasn't, it was at least very closely related to crown birds, and very important for understanding the origins of crown birds, but we don't know as much about it as we might like. So this is quite an important study in that regard. All right. Do you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, that's really neat. I love it when things like this come out where you have a specimen that's just like locked in rock and we can finally pull it out after all
Right.
these years. Kind of like the so-called the Littlefoot specimen for Australopithecus.
Yeah.
And I was going to say, like, curious reconstruction here. I'm glad you explained because I mean, I'm not used to hearing the words Vegavis and looking at this. You know,
Right.
it's like a gannet and a penguin had a
Right.
baby or something.
Yeah.
Um, but wow, that's really neat. Yeah, I definitely look forward to new news about this genus here.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, a lot of the earlier and a lot of the very popular reconstructions of Vegavis that you'll find online are based on the assumption that it was an anseriform. So a lot of them make it very kind of goose-like. Um, but yeah, like we don't have the head. We don't know actually how duck-like it would have looked. And if it wasn't an anseriform, then well, there's probably not much reason to assume that it was very very duck-like like in that regard. And yeah, polar ornis it does seem to have this sort of kind of narrow, long kind of bill. So it definitely wasn't a flattened bill like a duck. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, but yeah, well, we'll see. Hopefully, we'll find even more material of Vegavis someday and get to know it a bit better because it certainly seems to be a very intriguing taxon, that's for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, let's continue onward. So now we're kind of updating episode 4, the impossible knots. So this is where we kind of introduced ourselves to the group neoavians, which includes 95% of all living birds. So these are basically all birds, all living birds, except for the paleognaths and the galloanserans. And so one of the things we discussed in this episode is that neoavian phylogeny, like understanding how the different neoavian groups are related to each other, is just an absolute mess. And that's in fact the reason why I called the episode the impossible knot, because it seems like an impossible knot for us to untangle. And so this is a slide that I actually used. At least the images on the slide is one I actually used in that episode. So this is comparing kind of the results of different recent phylogenetic studies that have been done on neoavians, and these are genetic studies with using like very very long genetic sequences. In some cases, like basically whole genomes even to try and figure out the phylogeny of neoavians or crown birds in general, and in each case, they found quite different results. So far, no two kind of major studies on neoavian phylogeny agree with one another, and that's still an ongoing problem. It definitely has not been solved by any means. However, there was this new study that came out that was quite interesting, with some implications for kind of understanding neoavian phylogeny. So this study was based on the idea that that data type has an effect on the results of these phylogenetic studies on neoavians. Basically, what this means is the type of data that you input into the analysis kind of is driving some of the differences between these findings. Because, of course, when we realized that, okay, none of these studies are agreeing, so well, what's going on? People suggested some various different ideas for why we're finding such different results. Like some people suggest that maybe it's a number of species that is influencing. Like if you put more species in, you'll get a different tree from this other study, things like that. And certainly we know that kind of what species you include in phylogenetic analysis can have a pretty big effect on the overall results. However, in 2017, the Reddy et al. Study that is actually pictured on here, they basically threw in a ton of different species, and they didn't find a tree that was similar to the Prum et al. 2015 study, which also included a bunch of different species. And so they were like, maybe like, species number is not like the main factor that's driving these changes here. And they suggested that it was in fact a data type. So basically the type of genes that you're analyzing that is driving a lot of these differences. So a new study that came out earlier this year kind of investigated this further, and what they did was they took the Prum et al. Study that's pictured here, but they kind of reanalyzed that data set in various ways. So one of the ways that they reanalyzed it was that they used a method called RY coding, and to explain this, I have to kind of explain a bit about like genetics, which is not my field, but I'll try my best. So, as you might know from high school biology, DNA consists of 4 different nucleotide molecules, which are given the abbreviations A, T, C, and G. So that's the adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. I hope I got that right. And these nucleotides kind of link up with each other in consistent ways. So you know how a DNA has this kind of ladder-like structure, right? In the classic double helix. So in that ladder-like structure, the nucleotides on either side of it that kind of linked together to form the rungs of the ladder are always consistent. So A always links up with T, and C always links up with G. And it turns out that people have found that in some cases, basically the composition of the sequences, kind of the proportion of the C's and G's versus A's and T's, can have an effect on phylogenetic analyses. Sometimes the results of phylogenetic analyses find results that are different from one another, or exhibit like strong conflict where they can't really resolve what was going on at this particular part of the phylogeny. And in some cases, it's because there is a great proportion of C's and G's in the genetic sequences that are being analyzed, and it's basically giving you a false result. Like it's not giving you the correct relationships that actually show how the organisms relate to each other, but it's actually just linking together all the groups that happen to have a lot of C's and G's in that sequence, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they share a closer common ancestry. And to kind of get around this effect, people have used various different or suggested various different solutions. So one is called RY coding, and what this does is basically, instead of like when you analyze these genetic sequences, what you do is like you input the way you input these sequences is by the sequence of these nucleotides on each sequence, right? So you just put in a long string of like A T C G A T C G G G C C C T A A or whatever, right? And the phylogenetic analysis software like analyzes those sequences and finds which ones are most likely to be closely related and such. But instead of putting in the nucleotide sequences as A, T's, C's, and G's, RY coding kind of codes A's and C's as the same thing, and G's and T's as the same thing, because again they link up in kind of predictable ways. So what you're doing here, is basically removing the effects of having a lot of C's and G's in the sequence, and just scoring every nucleotide in the sequence as one of 2 kinds of letters. And so when you do this and analyze a Prum et al. Data set on the next slide, you can see the effects that were found in the study here, Brown and Kimball 2021. When you reanalyze the Plum et al. Dataset after doing this RY coding, you get a different tree from what they found. And I'll just flip back for a moment just so you can see the differences again. You'll see that in the original Plum et al. Study, they found that the group strisoreans was kind of the group that was related to all other neoavians, which is quite a different result from what a lot of these other studies have found, right? So most of these other studies have found that instead either Mirandornithes or Mirandornithes plus Columbomorphae are the sister group to all other neoavians. So Plum et al. Was kind of like an odd one out in that regard. But after doing this RY coding and kind of removing the effects of having this high proportion of C's and G's, Brown and Kimball found a very different result, where they found that Mirandornithes starts becoming the sister group to all other neoavians instead. And so this supports the hypothesis that kind of the data type, kind of the nature of the data itself, is what's driving a lot of these differences. And it does seem to add to the support that perhaps Mirandornithes is more likely to be the sister group to all the neoavians, or at least Mirandornithes plus Columbomorphae. So yeah, that was a pretty cool study, and they actually did a lot of other kind of reanalyses as well of the Plum et al. Dataset, but I won't go into too much detail here. The take-home message is that they found this kind of revised support for Mirandornithes and Columbomorphae being outside of the rest. However, as you can see, the rest of neoaves beyond those two still doesn't have much agreement between these different studies, even after doing all this kind of reanalysis. So, we can't say that the problem is completely solved. And as I mentioned in the episode, there's a chance that we'll never completely solve it. But it is good that we are trying all these new things and figuring out what's going on, because whatever we find will help us better understand bird evolution, and plus how to resolve like other kinds of phylogenetic problems as well. So yeah, that was a little bit kind of arcane perhaps, but I thought it was a pretty interesting study. What do you think?
No, I agree. I mean, like this impossible knot is proving to be a Gordian knot.
Yes.
Wow. But yeah, I mean, like that is the thing about it, isn't it? Like the kind of data that you have can like dramatically affect like what results you get.
Yep.
I mean, I see this a lot in anthropology as well. So like that's really fascinating. Wow.
Yeah, absolutely. Alrighty, so let's continue onward. So in episode 4, we started looking at neoavians, and we introduced a few of the groups of neoavians, not all of them, because that took the entire rest of the series, but we started looking at a few groups. And one of the groups that we looked at were the pigeons. And so this was a new study on pigeon evolution that I thought was quite fascinating. So as we discussed in the episode, pigeons are very good flyers. They're very strong flyers, and they can fly for very long distances. And oftentimes, they are able to colonize islands because of their strong flying skills. And indeed, kind of probably the most famous recently extinct animal, like an animal that died out, went extinct in historic times, was a giant pigeon, and that is namely the dodo of Mauritius. It was a giant flightless pigeon whose ancestors ended up on Mauritius, and it evolved to be flightless and became this really specialized form that is quite different in its overall appearance from what you think of as a typical pigeon. Island evolution is absolutely fascinating and has produced a lot of very interesting and distinctive forms like the dodo, but there has been this classic idea that islands are basically that island evolution leads to dead ends, basically. Like animals end up on islands, they evolve into all these weird forms, but then they just die out and never evolve into anything else, or they quickly go extinct due to various pressures that are more pronounced on the isolated in an isolated setting than they would be on a continent. But there was this new study that found out or found evidence that island colonization in pigeons actually drives some of their ecological and kind of species diversity. So what they did was, based on the phylogenetic relationships of pigeons, the authors estimated like how often do pigeons evolve into different types of ecological niches, and so that's kind of what is represented on the figure here. So on the left-hand side, you can see various types of niches filled by pigeons living in continental environments. So on top, AFC are pigeons living on continental environments that forage in arboreal settings, so in trees, so tree-dwelling pigeons. A lot of these are like fruit eaters. Then down below, you have TFC, so continental pigeons that are terrestrial foragers that kind of feed on the ground. Also, AFC and TFC are both forest-dwelling species as well. So that's what the F stands for there. They're forest-dwelling species that either live in the trees or on the ground. And then TOC are terrestrial pigeons on continents that live in open kind of habitats. And on the right-hand side, you have island-dwelling pigeon species. So there are also arboreal pigeons on islands as well, so that's AFI. And there are terrestrial foraging pigeons that live on islands, and that's TFI. And island-dwelling pigeons tend to be forest dwellers. There aren't so many open habitat pigeons on islands, so they don't have a open habitat equivalent here. But in any case, based on the phylogenetic relationships of pigeons, the authors estimated how frequently do pigeons transition between all these different types of ecological niches, and that's what the arrows here are representing. And you can see that the bigger and thicker arrows represent basically more frequent transitions. So what do we see here? Well, basically, something very curious is that on continents, you almost never get arboreal pigeons evolving from terrestrial pigeons. It's very, very rare, and you can see that the dotted line there kind of represents that. However, arboreal pigeons often end up on islands and kind of evolving into kind of island arboreal species there. And not only that, but terrestrial pigeons on islands often evolve into arboreal species on islands as well. And furthermore, terrestrial foraging pigeons that end up on islands also have a decent chance of evolving into arboreal island species of pigeons. And so you can see all that here. So it seems that island dwelling kind of promotes kind of the exploitation of this arboreal niche in pigeons. And not only that, but these arboreal island pigeons aren't always like evolutionary dead ends, because it turns out that not only do continental pigeons disperse to islands and evolve into kind of their own distinctive species there, but island pigeons sometimes disperse back into the continents, and you can see that kind of represented by the arrows there too, and evolve into new species of continental arboreal pigeons. So that is really interesting. It shows that kind of island dwelling has a notable effect on kind of increasing the diversity and ecology within pigeons. Whereas if it weren't for these island-dwelling arboreal species, like the terrestrial pigeons probably would very rarely evolve into arboreal foragers. But because of this these island species, we do have as many kind of arboreal foraging species as we do on the continents as well. So yeah, that's essentially a summary of that study. What do you think?
That is really fascinating. Wow. Not too much to add on there.
Yeah.
It definitely kind of explains, or at least it provides an example of sort of like the simplification of the island model, like you were talking about. Like, things were a lot more complex than we thought.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, definitely a pretty straightforward study, but I thought it was extremely interesting. Alrighty then, let's continue onward to to update the next episode. Yes, so this of course is an episode of particular significance to myself. So this was the episode on strisoreans, episode 5. So this is a group that includes hummingbirds and swifts and nightjars and their relatives. And this is one of my favorite groups of birds because they are just so incredibly unusual, and also because I worked on them for a couple of chapters of my PhD. And so I do have a personal connection to these birds. And it turns out that in the time since we made that episode, there have been a couple of very interesting studies that tell us some new things about how this very unusual group of dinosaurs evolved. And so this first study is a very cool one. I looked at facial development, so kind of how the shape of the face changes over growth in members of Strisoreans. So this episode, no, sorry, this study. So this study was done. The first author is Guillermo Nabalone. So Guillermo actually is currently a postdoctoral researcher here at my supervisor's lab. So a postdoctoral researcher, if you're not familiar with academia, is someone who has already gotten their PhD, but they haven't established their own lab yet. So what often happens is that after you get your PhD, you'll spend a number of years kind of working with a supervisor who does have a lab and kind of develop your own research further, maybe get some more experience, kind of helping to mentor the students in the lab and things like that. And so someone who's doing that is called a postdoc or a postdoctoral researcher. And so Guillermo is currently a postdoctoral researcher in the lab here. But he hadn't yet come over here at the time that he finished doing this study. So this was actually part of the research he did for his PhD. And earlier this year, the paper finally came out. And so, what he was looking at the development of the face in this very unusual group of birds. Because, if you know anything about members of Strisoreans, they have very funny-looking faces, like nightjars and potoos and such. They have huge mouths, very broad skulls, but the bills are rather short. You have things like frog mouths, which are you can just tell from their name how weird their faces look. And of course, you have the hummingbirds, which have extremely long and narrow beaks. So, pretty much all the members of Strisoreans have quite unusual skulls. And so he was kind of inspired to do this study because of an illustration in Katrina van Grau's The Unfeathered Bird. So if you're interested in kind of bird skeletal anatomy, highly encourage you to check out The Unfeathered Bird. It's beautifully illustrated, lots of really interesting aspects of anatomy that aren't often on display. And so in the Unfeathered Bird, there's an illustration of a nightjar, but drawn without any feathers. And then Guillermo saw this illustration and thought, that nightjar looks a lot like a baby bird, and because it has this really wide skull with a short beak, and if you've seen like a baby altricial birds that are kind of hatch out blind and helpless, they look a lot like that. They have this huge proportionally huge heads and these wide open mouths and such. And so Guillermo wondered, did this really broad skull of nightjars and other members of Strisoreans, did it evolve through a process called pedomorphosis, which is the retainment of juvenile features into adulthood? So is like a nightjar, is an adult nightjar like a blown up version of a baby bird, and that's why it has this big kind of broad skull like a baby bird. And so to do this study, he kind of looked at the shape of the skull across different growth stages of many different kinds of birds. And so on the left here, that figure is showing kind of basically hypothetical trajectories, hypothetical developmental kind of processes that could result in the kind of the adult form of a given bird. So in gray there is kind of what is assumed to be a normal kind of developmental trajectory. So on the left hand side of the graph, it's basically representing a juvenile, and then as they move towards the right, that's them growing up, and the y-axis there is meant to be like change in shape of the skull. And so basically, the gray there is representing kind of the hypothetical trajectory for an ancestral bird, growing from a juvenile to an adult, starting out with kind of rather broad beak, and then, growing up with a less broad one. And then his hypothesis for members of Strisoreans, or most of them that aren't hummingbirds, is kind of in the kind of tan or brownish arrow or yellowish arrow. Uh, so if members of Strisoreans evolved their skull shape by pedomorphosis, then what would occur is that they might grow a little bit, but then they stop and following the same trajectory as the ancestral shape change, but stopping earlier so that they keep the kind of juvenile shape of the skull. Does that make sense? Um,
Hmm.
yeah, and then something else that he also wanted to explore with this was like how hummingbirds got their like very long bills. So he hypothesized that maybe hummingbirds kind of changed up the ancestral pattern of Strisories and instead started to develop back along the ancestral kind of trajectory in the in the same direction as the ancestral trajectory, but faster, like an accelerated development. So that's why the slope of that line for the hummingbirds on top, in light green there, is higher than for the ancestral one. So they kind of accelerate their growth to get this really long bill. Okay, so that was a hypothesis, but then he had to test it. So he gathered information on the skull shapes of all kinds of different types of birds, including many members of Strisories, but also other types of birds as well for comparison. And so what he found was is pictured on the right here. And so for birds that aren't members of Strisories, which on this graph, I think it's easiest to see like the ones, the ostrich and the emu, these dark lines that towards the right-hand side. Although he also included like galliforms as well, the chicken-like birds, which are in a gray kind of arrow near the middle, but it might be a bit hard to see because it overlaps with all the others. But in any case, what he found was the ancestral kind of trajectory for for birds is kind of this this upward slope as depicted on this graph. So over time, this is how the skull shape changes, and he basically used a method called morphometrics to kind of represent skull shape as numbers, and so that's how he was able to plot this out onto the graph here. So okay, so that's basically the ancestral trajectory. And so what do we see with members of Strisories? Do they show a similar trajectory as that we would expect from the predomorphic one that is presented on the left-hand side? Well, it turns out that not really. So the members of Strisories that are on the graph on the right-hand side here, I'll try to point out a few. So like number 6 is a nightjar. Number 5 is a potu. And those are both like kind of yellowish brown lines. In teal are swifts, and in blue is a frogmouth, and kind of the purplish gray near the middle. I think that's number 7 is the oilbird, which is a fruit-eating member of Strisories, very weird animal. And it turns out in most members of Strisories, they do not exhibit this kind of a pedomorphic trajectory where they kind of grow along the same trajectory but then stop, at the same trajectory as other kinds of birds and then stop. But instead, they simply have a completely different trajectory from other birds. And so it seems that members of Strisories did not evolve their skulls by pedomorphosis, but simply by, changing how the shape of the skull changes over developmental growth. So that is interesting. That it was not quite what he expected, and it gives us yet another reason why members of Strisories are so weird. However, something else that was interesting is that there were a couple groups of Strisories that seem to have returned to the ancestral trajectory. And so one of these is the frogmouths in blue, and you can see how the developmental trajectory of frogmouths also slopes upward, like in the kind of quote unquote normal birds. So that's interesting, and that is consistent with kind of the shape of the skull in frogmouths, because frogmouths do have this very wide kind of mouth. But unlike a lot of the other members of Strisories, the bill is not very short. It's pretty long, and in fact, frogmouths are able to use this great big bill to like capture quite large prey items. In some cases, things like mice and lizards. So it does make sense that they have a different kind of developmental trajectory from other kinds of Strisories. And the second group does fit one of Guillermo's original predictions. The second group was, of course, the hummingbirds. The hummingbirds also kind of have this upwards trajectory on the graph here, and you can see them in kind of the top left corner of the graph. And not only that, but they do indeed exhibit this kind of accelerated development that gives them the very, very long bill that they have. So yeah, that was one prediction that was fulfilled. One last thing I'll highlight on the graph here is that it seems that the acceleration of development was something that is not unique to hummingbirds within Strisoreans, because if you recall from the episode that we did on this group, the hummingbirds are very closely related to the swifts, and it turns out that the swifts, even though they follow the ancestral trajectory of Strisoreans, like the normal trajectory of Strisoreans, where with this downward pointing trajectory, you can see that the slope of the trajectory is very high, it's very steep. So the swifts also have an accelerated development compared to other members of Strisoreans. And so it's likely that it was the last common ancestor of hummingbirds and swifts that evolved this accelerated development, and then hummingbirds decide to, turn that trajectory in a different direction, and then they got their really long, narrow, kind of nectar-feeding bills. So yeah, I really like this study. It really sheds a lot of light on how these birds became so weird, and yeah, I was really excited to see this out because I've seen Guillermo kind of present his research on this at scientific conferences in previous years. So yeah, major congrats to him for getting it published, and it's really cool. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. Also, I guess like major congrats to Katrina Van Grau. I
Yes.
mean, like I imagine that's the dream of any author publishing a scientific book, to put it out there for the public, and somebody reads it,
Mm-hmm.
notices a thing, and then is inspired to do more research.
Right.
Um, that's just fantastic. Yeah, I also a little bit unexpected where you were going with this. I thought it would be like, oh, they were paedomorphic, and then it's like welcome to the club with domestic animals
Right.
and probably humans.
Yeah. Right.
But hey, I mean, that's kind of half the important aspect of science. That
Mm-hmm.
that sometimes you do a study and you set out to think, oh, is this the case? And it turns out not to be the case. It's
Right.
like, okay, well, that's one thing you can check off the list.
Right.
And so I feel like a lot of those studies don't get a lot of press when you do a study and it turns out to be a negative result, and it's like,
Yeah.
oh, I thought you were onto something here, but then you still are.
Yeah. Right.
It's still important.
Yeah.
No,
Absolutely.
that's
Yeah, I also quite enjoyed that aspect of the study because yeah, it was like it seemed like such an intuitive idea, but ooh, then you actually do a study and it turns out no, that wasn't the case. But you still found out something really interesting about this group of animals. So in the end, it's a win-win.
absolutely.
Alrighty then. So let's continue to the next slide. And so this is another study on Strisoreans. This time focusing more on fossils. So this is actually a new species of fossil Strisorian called Archaeodromus that was discovered in England actually. And so the importance of this study is, it's particular in regards to the nightjars. But before we get to that, I should introduce this group called the Archaeotrogonids. Now, I actually did not really mention Archaeotrogonids in our episode on Strisoreans, and the reason for that was kind of in part because at the time I was still like really striving to kind of keep our episodes within a certain time limit, so I didn't want to go into like all the details of everything. And the thing is, like Archaeotrogonids at the time, we didn't really know that much about them. So even though they are a relatively notable kind of fossil bird group, I decided okay, I'll cut the slide on them out. So I didn't really mention. I might have sort of alluded to one of them if you are sharp-eared listener. I think I did maybe allude to one of them, but But yeah, overall, I didn't really cover them or give them their own slide or anything, so I guess I'll make up for that here. So the Archaeotrigonids are an extinct group of birds that are currently known from the Eocene to the Oligocene of Europe. So they've been found in France and Germany and now England as well. And in some regions, they are very abundant fossils, actually. There are quite a few specimens that are known. And as their name suggests, they were once thought to have been trogons. So trogons are a rather obscure group of tropical birds. We covered them in episode 11 of Dinosaurs, the second chapter, I believe. So trogons are not members of strisoreans, and are only very distantly related to them. But they're quite an interesting group. They're often very colorful and brightly colored. The they get their name. Their name means like gnawing, like chewing on something, and that's because they make nest holes by biting holes in trees. Yeah, by biting holes, not pecking holes. Yeah, so that's how they got their name. And yeah, they're quite an interesting group, and indeed the Archaeotrigonids, some of their bones, especially the forelimb bones, do resemble trogons, and so it's understandable why they were once considered to be members of the Trogon lineage and then given the name Archaeotrigonids. However, since then, more complete specimens have been found, including some that have a skull material. And as described earlier, members of Strisoreans have very distinctive-looking skulls. And so it seems that with these more complete specimens, it has become clear that the Archaeotrigonids are actually more likely to be members of Strisoreans and not members of the Trogon lineage. But despite that, we didn't really know what type of strisorean the Archaeotrigonids were, like how they relate to the living groups. So they do seem to have been, had a fairly standard strisorean lifestyle insofar as anything about strisoreans can be considered standard. Like they seem to have had these, very broad kind of nightjar-like mouths, so probably they were flying around and catching insects in the air. But yeah, it wasn't really clear what type of, which group of strisoreans they were most closely related to. But it turns out that with this new specimen and this new species, Archaeodromus from England, we might start having a better idea. So Archaeodromus is known from a number of bones. I only show a few here, so these are bones from the shoulder girdle and the forelimb. And you can see that these bones are quite well preserved. Like they are basically preserved in 3 dimensions, so a lot of the anatomical detail is visible. And there's also a little bit of the skull preserved as well, which also further kind of supports the fact that these guys are members of Strisoreans. And something really interesting about Archaeodromus is that a lot of the features that it preserves in these very well preserved bones seem to suggest that it was most closely related within Strisoreans to the nightjars, and that is quite an important find if it is further supported by future studies, because I think I did mention this in the episode. The fossil record of nightjars is very sparse, and that's actually quite in contrast to a lot of the other members of Strisoreans, like from the Eocene Meso Formation and the Green River Formation. So Meso is from Germany, Green River is in North America. We found like early members of like the Potu lineage and the frogmouth lineage and the swift and hummingbird lineage, and like members of the swift lineage specifically and the hummingbird lineage specifically. So like all these other members of Strisoreans, or almost all the other kind of major groups of Strisoreans, have these fossil members represented in these really in these fossil sites that are very good for preserving bird fossils. But we didn't have clear examples of stem nightjars, and that was something really odd because the nightjars are actually one of the most diverse groups of Strisoreans alive today, and most widely distributed as well. Like they can basically be found on all the continents except for Antarctica today. And other than the swifts and hummingbirds, they are more diverse than all the other groups that I just mentioned. So yeah, like where were the stem nightjars? Well, it turns out that maybe we had them all along. If it is true that the Archaeotrigonids were stem nightjars, then actually we did have a lot of stem nightjar fossils from the Paleogene of Europe, and so this is quite a notable find in that regard. Yeah, that fills in quite an important gap in kind of the fossil record of birds that we didn't, recognize was there. And one last thing I'll mention, that's kind of unusual about archaeotrogonids, is that some of them, including Archaeotrogon itself, but also apparently in undescribed specimens of Archaeodromus also show this. On their kind of wrists, they seem to have had these protruding kind of knobs on them. And if when we find these kinds of knobs in like other types of birds, they're often used for fighting each other, so they like hit each other with their wings. Sometimes they're used to defend from predators as well. And this is very unusual for members of Strisoreans. None of the living members of Strisoreans have such structures like this, but it seems that like the Archaeodrogonids did. So yeah, that's something kind of weird about them. So yeah, I'm very glad that we finally have this better understanding of these Archaeotrogonids. Actually, one final thing I'll mention is that in my own study on like the phylogeny of Strisoreans, I actually included a species from the Meso Formation that is thought to probably be an Archaeotrogonid. So that's a species called Hoatzins, and Hoatzins is known from like fairly complete specimens, but they're kind of squished flat, so it's hard to make out a lot of the details. And in my study, I recovered it as maybe a stem member of the owlet nightjar lineage. And just so we're clear, like the owlet nightjar lineage is not a member of the nightjars. They are more closely related to the swifts and hummingbirds, but that's just what they're called. And for the record as well, if you don't recall from like the Strisoreans episode, the po2s and the frogmouths and such, they are all like different groups from the nightjars. Like even though they all look quite similar and were once grouped together into like a clade separate into a group kind of separate from the hummingbirds and swifts, we now know that like the po2s and frogmouths and owlet nightjars are all like more closely related to the hummingbirds and swifts than to like the true nightjars. So yeah, they're all different groups, even though they're all members of Strisoreans. But in any case, in my study, I found that maybe Hoatzins was a stem owlet nightjar. However, with this new study, the author Gerald Meyer, he actually pointed out that the kind of the features that were supporting the owlet nightjar position for Hoatzins in my study, you know, are actually like kind of expressed a bit differently in owlet nightjars versus in Hoatzins, and it seems more likely that that Hoatzins was an Archaeotrogonid, and Archaeotrogonids are more closely related to the true nightjars instead. And fair enough. I scored that information based on what I had available at the time, and that's just the way science is. We're gonna get things wrong. So yeah. In any case, I am very excited that we finally know more about this very mysterious group, and yeah, I'm glad that we finally have possible candidates for the STEM nightjars now. Do you have anything to add to this?
Oh, I'm very happy for you that we're able to kind of plug in the STEM group to the nightjar lineage. I know that's always a big help of trying to understand the evolution of those groups.
Yeah.
It's like we're gonna get those STEM chimpanzees at some point soon.
Right, right.
But wow, the knobs on the wrists is kind of surprising to me. But you mentioned like a number of other bird groups have done this too. I know there was that ibis from the Caribbean, I believe.
Yeah, that's right.
Xenocibus?
Yes, Dinosaurs, yeah, from Jamaica. Yeah, that's a weird one because basically its entire kind of palm is like modified into like a bat-like structure to hit things
right.
with. Yeah, yeah.
So to kind of see that in a proto nightjar, if you will, well, something similar to that at least. Yeah. That's got to be interesting, and I guess no shortage of weirdness for Strisoreans. I guess.
No. Indeed. So yeah, those are a couple of very cool studies on this group that came out. Definitely very exciting for me. But let's continue onward. All right, so we've come to episode 6. So this episode is the one where we talked about the gruiforms for most part. We also talked about a few other things, but basically the group containing the cranes and the rails and their kin. And so a number of interesting studies came out that have implications for our understanding of the evolution of this group as well. And so the first study I'll highlight here is one on the phylogenetic position of a genus called Nisotrochus. So Nisotrochus, it was this probably relatively recently extinct genus of gruiform that lived on the Greater Antilles. So it's known from several species that are found on various different islands there, including like Cuba, for example. And it seems to have been a flightless gruiform, and traditionally it has been considered a rail. And we talked about this in the episode that rails are very good at getting to islands, and once they get to islands, they almost always become like flightless, basically. And they have evolved like flightlessness dozens and dozens of times, and we're always finding like new species of extinct rails that have become flightless on islands. So yeah, it's kind of it's an evolutionary trajectory that's very popular with them. And so it used to be thought that Nizotrachus was another of these kind of island flightless rails. So I didn't even mention it specifically in the episode. We didn't have time to go over like all these different species of flightless rails. So I just gave a few particularly unusual examples and moved on. But then came this new study on the phylogenetic position of Nizotrachus. Well, I should say that the findings of this study were not completely unprecedented, because in a rather recent paper, but one that came out before the study, where they basically compared kind of the foot anatomy, the anatomy of the foot skeleton between different gruiforms, suggested that maybe Nizotrachus was not a rail, but more closely related to a group called the flufftails. And the flufftails are closely related to rails, but with recent genetic studies, it has been found that the flufftails are actually more closely related, even more closely related to a group called the finfoots. And the finfoots look very different from like your typical rail. Like they are like specialized swimmers. Like they swim on the surface of the water a lot of time. And like a rail can do that too, but they don't spend as much time doing it as a finfoot would. And the flufftails are very rail-like, but it turns out that they were more closely related to the finfoots than to the true rails, and so now we recognize them as a separate group from the rails. And they're a rather mysterious and poorly studied group, these flufftails. Originally we recognized several species that live in Africa and Madagascar. But quite recently, genetic studies have confirmed that there are also some species that were thought to be rails, but are actually flufftails in New Guinea. So that kind of extended their range. But it actually had been suspected previously that those New Guinea species were actually closely related to flufftails. It's just that we didn't have genetic samples for them back then. And anyways, there was a recent anatomical study comparing the foot structure of different gruiforms that found, or that suggested that Nizotrachus has a foot structure that is more characteristic of this flufftail and finfoot group, and not so much of the rails. And so it was suggested that Nizotrachus was maybe closely related to flufftails as well, but there wasn't genetic evidence to confirm this. And Nizotrachus, it's from the Greater Antilles, so it is very, very distant from like any of the living flufftails in terms of its geographic distributions, or the ones that we know of. But in a new study, they were able to extract kind of genetic material from molecular sequences from Nizotrachus. And when they analyze this in a phylogenetic analysis, it turns out that, whoa, Nizotrachus is more closely related to flufftails than to rails. So yeah, that kind of confirmed that earlier hypothesis. And in addition to Nizotrachus, flufftails, and finfoots, kind of this group of gruiforms also includes, as we discussed in the episode, the aidsbills of New Zealand, which are perhaps the most unusual group, arguably the most unusual group within this assemblage. So these were these rather large flightless birds of New Zealand that probably preyed on smaller animals, so like smaller birds, other kinds of reptiles, large insects. Other than the Haas eagle, they were probably the largest land predators on New Zealand until they went extinct in recent times. So yeah, it turns out that the flufftails, which we did not even recognize as a group separate from the rails until like within the last, I don't know, 2 decades or so have this like really interesting kind of evolutionary legacy where they're closely related to a bunch of unusual, recently extinct groups that are very widely distributed, or at least give this whole lineage a very wide distribution. And on the next slide, I actually have a figure from the paper kind of depicting this. So in blue are where fluff-tails are found today. You can see that they're found in sub-Saharan Africa, in Madagascar, and recently recognized in New Guinea. But they have their close extinct relatives, the aidsbills of New Zealand and the various species of Nisotrochus from the Greater Antilles as well. And so, yeah, it turns out that this group of birds that we didn't really know was a thing actually has this amazing kind of family history to it. So yeah, this was a pretty cool study, and I really it's really I don't know if cathartic is the right word, but it's satisfying to see when like earlier hypotheses based on more morphology get confirmed by these new genetic studies. So yeah, this was pretty cool. What do you think?
No, I definitely agree. And also kind of I can definitely see the relations now that they're kind of displayed on the map like this.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, I'm sure like the earlier distribution of the continents would be a little bit different, but this more or less kind of gets the point across.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that's so cool. Wow.
Yeah, quite amazing. That's for sure. All right, let's continue on to the next slide. And all right, so this is a study that I teased earlier with the paleognaths. So yes, this study looked at a number of kind of mysterious large birds from the Paleogene. Well, actually not just the Paleogene, various groups of large extinct birds that, in the last couple of decades have generally been accepted as members of gruiformes because they exhibit some similar features to cranes, especially in the hind limb. In fact, a lot of these fossil birds are only known from hind limb bones. So there are a couple of groups that are involved here, and I actually discussed these in our episode. So there are the geranoidids. The geranoidids are a group that are only known from hind limb bones. They are these very large birds, but we don't know much about their overall anatomy, and they're known from the Eocene of North America. And then there are the eogruids and the ergulornithids. And in the episode, if you go back to that, I didn't consider these two separate groups, so they were all lumped under the eogruids. But with the findings of this new study here, it has been suggested that they should be recognized as separate groups again, and for reasons that we'll get to soon. Basically, the eogruids and ergulornithids were also these relatively large birds with long legs that are primarily known from Eurasia, especially Central Asia. A lot of species have been found in Central Asia. And they are particularly unusual because over time, it seems that they kind of reduced one of their toes until they only had 2 toes left on their feet. That is a very unusual thing. There is only one other group of birds that has done this, and those are the ostriches. So ostriches only have 2 toes per foot, and basically, the eogruids and the ergulornithids. The eogruids are the ones with like a reduced kind of toe, but it's not fully disappeared yet, and the ergulornithids are the ones where it's been fully reduced, so they only have truly kind of 2-toed feet. And so this feature is only found in ostriches among the other birds, and it actually has been suggested in the past by other bird paleontologists that maybe the eogruids and ergulornithids were actually closely related to ostriches. But that idea kind of fell out of favor because other paleontologists later pointed out that a lot of these features we see in the hind limbs of these birds are actually more similar, or they seem to have been more similar to gruiforms, and besides, they seem to have features that are characteristic of neonate birds, so they couldn't be paleonates, and therefore they weren't stem ostriches, and thus this kind of reduction of toes is convergent between the eogruids and the and ostriches. All right, so that was kind of the previous consensus. But then this new study came out, and what they did was they described a number of new specimens of these eogruids and ergulornithids, um, and including a skull, or part of one at least. So that is the one pictured on the left-hand side there. So that fossil skull, we're seeing these skulls from the top here, and so you can see that's the back of the skull. The front of the skull is not preserved, so we're seeing the top of the back of the skull there. It's not very much, but it does exhibit some features that are clearly more similar to ostriches than two members of gruiforms. And so here the gruiform representative is a limpkin, which is a snail-eating specialist. That we talked about it in the episode. They're closely related to cranes. And so, for example, there is this kind of notch, and that's kind of pictured in the inset close-up there, the FGN. That's what it's pointing to. There's this kind of notch like above the eye socket there, that is found in the fossil skull of that probably belongs to an eogruid or an ergulornithid, and in ostriches, but not in gruiforms. And overall, the back half of the skull, like in other aspects too, it also more closely resembles ostriches than it does gruiforms. And this is actually a really cool specimen to be described, because it actually was mentioned, the specimen, in some of these early papers that discuss the relationships of eogruids and similar birds. Like some of those early authors who thought that eogruids might have been stem ostriches actually did say, oh, there's this weird skull that might belong to an eogruid, but they didn't show any pictures of it or anything. So it's only now that we finally get to take a proper look at it, thanks to these new authors. And so, yeah, it turns out that this skull does exhibit ostrich-like features. And furthermore, they looked at details of the hind limb skeleton in eogruids and ergulornithids, and it turns out that they also exhibit certain features that are characteristic of ostriches as well. For example, eogruids and ergulornithids have this little bump, this little tubercle on their tibiotarsus. Tibiotarsus is the shin bone, so it's a fusion of the shin bone and some of the ankle bones in birds. So a fusion of the tibia and the tarsi, that's why it's called the tibiotarsus. And you can see the little bump is marked as TBC on the figures here on the right-hand side. But not only is this feature found in ostriches, but it is also found in Paleotis. The Paleotis is this extinct paleognath from the Eocene of Europe, and we're pretty darn sure it's a paleognath because we have basically complete skeletons and it looks like a paleognath. However, it does have a lot of these features that are found in the hind limb skeleton of the eogruids and ergulornithids, and furthermore, it has some of the features that people used to say were only found in neonath birds, but not in paleognaths that were found in the eogruids and such. But it turns out that these features are also found in Paleotis, which for sure is a paleognath. So the Paleotis kind of links, kind of is like the bridging kind of form that's like linking these neonath features to the ostrich lineage. And that's also significant for what we understand about Paleotis, because until this study, it actually has been rather debated what type of paleognath Paleotis was. So it has also been suspected to have been a stem ostrich by previous authors. But in newer studies, people are like, maybe it's a stem ostrich, but we can't really tell. The evidence isn't that strong. But with this new study, it turns out that when we add in the eogruids and the ergulornithids, we actually have a rather kind of nice transition in terms of the evolutionary history of ostriches. And so on the next slide is the kind of hypothesized phylogenetic relationships of all these groups of birds proposed by these authors. Now, I should stress that this was not like the result of a phylogenetic analysis, so this is more kind of what they think is likely to be the relationships based on the features they observed. But yeah, this still needs to be tested by running an actual analysis. However, I do think it is fairly compelling. And so they suggest that the Paleotis Paleotidids, so Paleotis and its cousins, are indeed stem ostriches, like early members of the group from the Eocene. and they are the first to kind of start exhibiting some of these so-called neonate-like features. And the geronoidids, they also exhibit similarities to both the eogruids and the paleotidids, so they are also considered probably stem ostriches here as well. And then later on, you get the emergence of the eogruids and the ergulornithids, and with the recognition that these are probably stem ostriches instead of gruiforms, it seems that the eogruids and ergulornithids should be considered separate groups because basically the gradual reduction of the toe of the second toe it probably leads up to like modern ostriches instead of being like a unique feature to eogruids plus ergulornithids together. And so kind of they split out the eogruids and the ergulornithids from one another, and then finally all of these are found on the stem leading up to ostriches. And this is quite significant for a number of reasons. So first of all is that the ostrich fossil record, if it weren't for these fossil groups, we only had like definite fossil ostriches going back to the Miocene or so. But with the eogruids and the paleotidids and the geronoidids, we actually turns out that we actually did have fossil representatives of stem ostriches going back into the Eocene. So another kind of gap there has been filled. And secondly, all these fossil groups are found in the northern hemisphere. So the paleotidids are from Europe, geronoidids are from North America, and eogruids and ergulornithids are from Eurasia, especially Central Asia. And as we discussed in the episode on paleognaths, the classic idea was that paleognaths all originated in the southern hemisphere. It turns out that if all of these guys are stem ostriches, then it seems more likely that the ostrich lineage actually originated in the northern hemisphere, and it just so happens that the only surviving ostriches are found in Africa today, but that doesn't mean that's where they originated. So, I would consider this study to be like probably one of the biggest studies, like in terms of like how much it changes our understanding of fossil birds in our field of the past year. So yeah, this was really cool study. It's great that we finally figured out what the eogruids and geronoidids and such are. If you go back to the episode that we did, we actually did mention that, oh yeah, some people have noticed that geronoidids and eogruids have similarities to paleotidids, so maybe they're not gruiforms, and well, yeah, this later study kind of confirms those earlier suspicions. So, overall, really exciting and excellent study, at least if you're a fossil bird fan. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, like this is fantastic. How important like a single fossil or like a few other like specimens can be in really
Mm-hmm.
like unraveling these lost relationships, if you will. I guess like you can now. I mean, I guess if this phylogenetic relationship holds up, I guess now you can kind of like trace the evolution of like ostrichy features over time
Yeah,
as like through the Cenozoic.
absolutely.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, that is really remarkable.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely, one of the biggest finds of the year so far, at least in the field of fossil birds. So, we're really excited for this, and that's also why I used a figure from this paper as the title slide of this episode. Um, but in any case, with that being said, let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so this is for part 7, which was the episode on shorebirds or coragiforms. Although actually the study on this slide is not only relevant to coragiforms, but I put it here because this is actually a pretty minor thing. I thought it was interesting to bring it up since I mentioned it in the episode. So I mentioned in the episode that coragiforms, one of their kind of distinctive anatomical features that distinguishes them from most other bird groups is that they have these depressions on the sides of their back vertebrae, and these are kind of pictured on the slide here. Now, they are not only found in coragiforms, but they're pretty rare in most other living groups of birds. However, they are pretty widely found in stem birds that are closely related to crown birds. So the things like Ichthyornis, for example, have them. And so there was this new study, also by Gerald Meyer, who is responsible for quite a few fossil bird studies. I mention his name constantly in this series, and he is responsible for many of the studies I talk about in this episode. So he basically surveyed kind of the distribution, like which birds have these vertebral depressions and which don't, and then tried to see if he could notice any kind of common pattern in them and figure out what the function of these depressions might be. And it turns out that what he suggests is that these depressions might relate to kind of the structural strength of vertebrae, or improving or reinforcing the structural strength of these vertebrae. Because what he found was that these depressions are rare in birds that have other ways of kind of stiffening their vertebral column. So in birds, for example, some birds have a lot of the back vertebrae that are all fused together, which is pretty weird. But yeah, they fuse several of the vertebrae together, and so those birds tend not to have these depressions. Birds that have air sacs in their vertebrae. So a kind of classic hypothesis for why these depressions are there is to fit air sacs in there, but they're kind of distinct from like the actual openings for air sacs, which are actually there is one example that's pictured here. So a nose, which is a type of shorebird called a noddy, which is closely related to gulls. You can see that there are these like openings in the sides of vertebrae in addition to the depressions, and so those like deep openings are indeed for air sacs, but the kind of just having these depressions there, they don't seem to actually fill be spaces for air sacs in most cases. In fact, Gerald Meyer pointed out that birds that have these depressions tend not to have like air sac openings in their upper arm bone. So the humerus, and so in many ways the birds that have these depressions are actually less pneumatic than birds that don't have them. So these depressions don't seem to be directly related to like air sacs, and so he suggested that perhaps the main function of having these depressions is like to improve like structural strength of the vertebrae. However, this does remain to be tested in like actual like biomechanical studies. And he also suggested that perhaps the last common ancestor of all crowned birds had these depressions, like based on the fact that things like ichthyornis have them. It's just that in most groups, with some exceptions like the gruiforms, these depressions were lost, and probably because they evolved these additional kind of structural adaptations to improve the strength of the vertebrae. Yeah, birds that do have air sacs in the vertebrae also tend not to have these depressions either, because the air sac openings themselves would function similarly to having these depressions. There are exceptions like the noddy I mentioned earlier, so which has both, but in most cases that doesn't happen. So yeah, this is also kind of a rather arcane subject, and it's something that I only briefly mentioned in passing in the episode. It's not like huge game changer, but for those of us who are interested in avian anatomy, it is always interesting to find out more about these features that people have noticed, but we don't really know kind of the functional or evolutionary significance of. So it's a good thing that there are people out there doing this work. Do you have anything else to add?
I guess it kind of goes to show there's a little bit something to the transitional shorebird idea, but just not in the way that is usually talked about.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And we did mention that kind of in the episode too, right? Yeah. We said that the transitional shorebird idea is perhaps not accurate in its classic form. So the idea that shorebirds gave rise to all their crowned birds is not supported by our current knowledge of phylogenetics, but probably it's not crazy that perhaps crown birds did indeed evolve from a rather shorebird-like ancestor. Yeah, I'm starting to buy that honestly, and as I mentioned, like some of our research on like Asteriornis seems to support that as well. That a lot of shorebird-like features might have been present in like ancestral crown birds, even if they weren't members of like the true shorebird group. So yeah, definitely, this is consistent with that indeed. Alrighty, so let's go on to the next slide. So I didn't have any kind of major updates for episode 8, which was when we started looking at like the big water bird clade, including penguins and loons and tropic birds and such. There have been a number of new fossils that have been found from members of that group. There have been some fossil penguins that have been described, but nothing that would like majorly change anything I said in the episode. So I don't have major updates for that. But for the next episode, where we kind of finished off looking at that big water bird clade, where we started looking at things like pelicans and boobies and herons and such, that is episode 9, there is an update to make here, and that is a new stem pelican has been described called Eopelecanus, the dawn pelican, and it is from the Eocene of Egypt. It is only known from this one bone that is figured here. This is a tibiotarsus, so a shin bone, or the fused shin and ankle bones. But even though it is only one bone, it does seem to be most similar to pelicans compared to all other living birds. And it would be, if it is indeed a stem pelican, the oldest known stem pelican. So it kind of fills in, a little bit of the gap from there. I mentioned in the episode that kind of the oldest known definite stem pelicans that we had previously were from the Oligocene, and they already looked a lot like modern pelicans. Now, we don't know how similar kind of Eopelecanus was to modern pelicans. It was, within the size range of modern pelicans. It was kind of the size of some of the smaller pelican species alive today, which are still very large birds. But we don't really know much about the rest of its appearance, so not much we can say there. But the fact is that we now have this kind of another record for like the oldest known member of this lineage. And the fact that it's found in Egypt is also interesting because if you recall, the closest living relatives to pelicans are the shoebill and the hammerkop, which are two like very weird looking African water birds, or primarily African in the hammerkop's case. So even though pelicans today are found basically all over the world, if Eopelecanus is relevant to this, then the fact that it's found in Egypt perhaps may support the idea that this entire group of birds, like the pelicans and shoebills and the hammerkop, their last common ancestor originated in Africa. So that's definitely an interesting idea. Of course, it doesn't demonstrate that it was a case, but it is consistent with that. So yeah, do you have anything to add to this before we continue?
Not particularly, but that's really cool.
Yeah, fair enough. Let's go on to the next slide. So now we get to episode 10, where we looked at some of the raptorial groups of birds. So some of the raptors, in particular, we looked at the hawks and eagles, the accipitrimorphs, and also the owls in this episode, the strigiforms. So there actually have been a number of interesting discoveries related to the accipitrimorphs over the past year, which is very cool because that group does not have a great recognized fossil record. One of the interesting new specimens that came out over the past year, I was able to kind of incorporate into the episode, and that was like aviraptor, which is this very small Oligocene hawk. But a few others have come out since then as well. And so here's one. This is another Oligocene accipitrimorph called Archaehyrax, and this one is from the Oligocene of Australia. So that's cool for a number of reasons. As an Oligocene, species, it's also one of the older species of accipitrimorph that have been discovered. And Archaehyrax is actually quite completely known. I show here a tarsometatarssus, so a fused bones of the foot and ankle. However, a large chunk of the rest of the skeleton is known as well. Like we have bones from like I think all 4 of its limbs. We have some vertebrae. We have even parts of the skull as well. So this is one of the most completely known fossil raptors there is, especially from so early in their evolutionary history. and it's actually quite a large animal. It's estimated to have been somewhere between 3 and 5 kilograms, so it's like the size of a small turkey. Yeah, quite a large raptor. Probably was able to hunt rather sizable animals. It wasn't as the largest raptor that lives in Australia today, the wedge-tailed eagle, which gets a little bit bigger than that, but it was still pretty big. So it was probably hunting things like relatively large birds, so like waterfowl, maybe decently sized mammals, like the juveniles of early koalas, or like relatives of possums, things like that. So yeah, quite an impressive predator. Shockingly, this study actually includes a phylogenetic analysis of these accipitrimorphs. So they actually included this fossil species into a phylogenetic analysis with a bunch of like living accipitrimorphs to find out which ones it might have been closely related to. It turns out that Archaeorax, you know, I say this is shocking because phylogenetic analyses of like anatomical that use anatomical features from accipitrimorphs are very rare. In fact, phylogenetic analyses of like fossil raptors in general are extremely rare. But this study had one, so that was great to see. And it turns out that it kind of depending on the methods you use, Archaeorax pops up in different places in the accipitrimorph tree, but it seems that it is not especially closely related to any of the living species of accipitrimorphs. So they do find it as a crown accipitrid. So it is a kind of quote unquote modern member of like the hawk and eagle group. But it's not especially closely related to any living species within that group. So that that kind of makes sense for such an early form. So yeah, quite a notable find. It's not common that you get such a completely known fossil raptor. It's not common that you get anyone running phylogenetic analyses on them and understanding or trying to understand where they go. And it is also quite a large and impressive animal on top of that. So this was a pretty cool finding. Do you have anything to add to this?
No, I mean that's it's great to hear that they actually took the phylogenetic route. I'm sure some paleoanthropologists would take note.
Indeed. Yeah, so that was a cool finding. Here's another one, a much more recently extinct form from the Pleistocene. So this is a Pleistocene, another member of the hawk and eagle group, so it's an accipitrid, Buteogallus irpus, from the Pleistocene of Cuba. It is known from this tarsometatarssus pictured on the left here, and also there's also a partial skeleton as well. It is another quite a large species. It is larger than Archaeorax, in fact, though very large by modern standards. And it's I mention it here not just because it is a large and impressive animal, but also because of implications it has for one of the species we talked about in the episode itself. And so I mentioned in the episode that there was this large raptor from the Pleistocene of North America called at the time I called it Amplibuteo woodwardi. It has been given a common name, Woodward's eagle, and it is mainly known from like deposits from the United States, especially places like La Brea, the La Brea tar pits. But it was thought previously that we also had specimens from Cuba as well. However, this new study describing the new Buteogallus irpus found that it's more likely that the Cuban specimens that were previously thought to be the Woodward's eagle actually belong to the new species Buteogallus irpus. So Buteogallus woodwardi is no longer known from Cuba and is restricted, as far as we know, to the United States. The second thing that is worth updating here is that the authors of this new study decided to reclassify the genus Amplibuteo as the same thing as the genus Buteogallus. So Buteogallus is actually a living genus, so there are like living members that belong to the genus Buteogallus. There are living hawks, the species like the common black hawk. So this is a genus of hawks that are known primarily from like rather warm regions of the Americas, primarily South America, but there are species that get up into like northern North America, and yeah, they are known from kind of rather wide range of sizes and environments. But it seems that in the past, and in the fossil record, they were more diverse still, because we have Buteogallus woodwardi, which was one of the largest known raptors of all time, or largest known accipitrimorphs of all time, I should say. And formerly, it and some other fossil raptors were given a separate genus Amplibuteo, but with re-examination done by these authors in this new study, they suggested that Amplibuteo actually is nested within the genus Buteogallus, and so they should all be transferred to this living genus Buteogallus. And so the Woodward's eagle is currently now considered Buteogallus woodwardi and not Amplibuteo woodwardi. Now, Buteogallus urpus is also quite a large species. Not as large as woodwardi, I think, but pretty large in its own right. In fact, the species name Irpus means a wolf, so this is like a wolf hawk. In fact, I think they actually suggest that its common name should be called wolf hawk, because it would have been one of the largest predators on the island of Cuba when it was around. So in that sense, one of the apex predators similar to a wolf, so they called it the wolf hawk. So yeah, that's kind of an update to something I mentioned in the in the episode, and you also get a new species out of it. So there's that. Do you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, I say that's a win-win. Wow, Wolfhawk, that's badass. I like that a lot.
Yeah.
No, that's awesome.
Yeah, and in some of the earlier papers by these authors, they actually have kind of hinted at the fact that maybe Amplibuteo should be considered the same thing as Buteogallus, but this was kind of the first paper where they actually went and decided that yep, we're gonna make that change. And so yeah, we'll see how other ornithologists respond to that, but personally, I don't have a problem with it. And to be honest, there aren't that many people doing taxonomy on these fossil raptors anyway, which kind of relates to what I said about like the lack of phylogenetic analyses earlier. So yeah, I suspect that this change is going to stick around for quite a while. Okay, so let's go on to the next slide. So this is going to be for episode 12 now. So yeah, I don't have much to add to episode 11. Episode 11 was the one we talked about trogons and kuros and mousebirds, which are three groups of very obscure birds, which have a fascinating fossil record. But yeah, there wasn't really anything that came out in the last year or so to change what I said in there. So yeah, we're going to go on to episode 12. In episode 12, we talked about a group called picocoracians, which includes woodpeckers and kingfishers and a number of their relatives. And so here we have a new specimen that was found that is relevant to one of the groups we talked about. So this is a new specimen of a fossil genus called Septoncoracias. Septoncoracias is previously known from a species that was in turn known from a single specimen from the Eocene of Denmark. And that was actually a pretty good specimen. Like, it was an essentially complete skeleton. With a lot of the bones visible and such. It was kind of preserved partially flattened and such, so we couldn't see all the details, but it was a pretty good specimen, especially for a fossil bird. And it was considered a stem member, so a stem member of a group called Coracioidea. This is the clade that unites the rollers and the ground rollers. And so these are the rollers and ground rollers are pretty close relatives to kingfishers. The rollers especially are these very colorful birds. They often perch in rather prominent perches, and they have these proportionally quite large heads, which they use to kind of grab their prey. They hunt insects, which they're able to skillfully catch in the air, but they also go after small vertebrates as well. So they'll hunt small mammals, small lizards, small frogs, smaller birds in some cases. So yeah, quite effective hunters, and many of them are very beautifully colored, like often bright blues, greens, and pinks and purples even. So quite an amazing group of birds. And as mentioned in the episode, we actually have a lot of fossils from the stem lineage that unites the rollers and the ground rollers. The ground rollers, just to review, they're closely related to rollers, but are mostly ground dwelling, as their name suggests. And in the present day, they're only found in Madagascar. So yeah, they're kind of an unusual group of this lineage. But in any case, we do have quite a number of fossil members of this lineage, including Septincoracias from the Eocene of Denmark. In fact, it is the oldest known member of this lineage. Now, in the past year, in fact, this paper came out in the past month or so. There was a new specimen described, and this one was not from Denmark but from England, and so it reveals some new features, even though it is not as complete as the type specimen of Septincoracias. It does preserve the bones in 3 dimensions, and it preserves most of the foot, and it preserves parts of the skull, and it turns out that it has some features that are similar to bee eaters, which are the bee eaters are another group that are closely related to the kingfishers and the rollers, but they're not a member of the Caracioids. And so some of the features that are similar to the bee eaters that are shown in the specimen of Septincoracias are some of the bones in the foot are kind of widened. Their toe bones are kind of widened at the tips, which is a feature that you don't really see in modern rollers, but you do see in bee eaters. So on the kind of comparison on the right here is a bee eater foot, and you can see how they share this kind of widened structures at the tips of the toe bones here. So yeah, that's kind of unusual. However, despite these features similar to bee eaters, when run in a phylogenetic analysis, the author, well, again, Gerald Meyer, he still found that Septincoracias was most likely a stem member of Caracioidea, so it probably still was more closely related to rollers than to bee eaters. But the fact that it had these bee eater-like features is very interesting because, as pictured on the next slide, which is kind of recycled from the episode, the rollers and ground rollers are most closely related to the bee eaters among all the other carassiform birds. And which is kind of one of the few, I would say, one of the few surprises regarding the phylogeny of this bird, regarding the phylogeny of these birds that came from genetic studies, is because the bee eaters classically were thought to be more closely related to like the kingfishers and motmots and such than to the rollers, but genetic studies have found them closer to the rollers instead. And well, this new specimen of Septincoracias, one of the oldest known lineages, stem Caracioids, if it has like bee eater like features, then maybe it represents kind of a link between these two groups, and so some of these bee eater like features might actually be ancestral to like the last common ancestor of bee eaters and rollers, and providing kind of evidence from the fossil record for this relationship. So yeah, the Septincoracias, for the record, was a classically, in the original description, it was considered a member of this fossil stem Caracioid group, the primobuconids, which is a possibility. But yeah, it is unclear, given the new information from this new specimen, whether that's still the case or not, because the other primobuconids don't seem to have these bee eater-like features. So maybe Septincoracias represents a more distant relative to the living rollers and ground rollers. Well, we'll see. Further study is needed. But in any case, I thought the fact that we have this kind of fossil link between the bee eaters and the rollers pretty significant. So yeah, I decided to talk about this study. Do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I think it's just great that when you have a situation where you have the molecular studies
Right.
showing relationships, and then you get the fossils that you can go and actually like see the anatomical changes, or
Right.
at least hints of these same relationships that you wouldn't otherwise get today.
Yeah.
So I think that's just fantastic.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so I think the next we're on the last 2 slides now with this next slide. So I don't have any new updates to make for part 13, which was the episode on the Seriemas and terror birds and their relatives. So yeah, fascinating group, but not much new has changed since I talked about them. So yeah, we'll see what future studies bring. However, for part 14, where we talked about the falcons and the parrots, there are a number of new studies on parrot cognition that I thought were quite interesting, so I decided to discuss them here. So if you recall from the episode, we actually had quite a lengthy tangent, if you will, discussing the evolution of kind of avian cognition, and especially how it's especially well developed in parrots. And of course, in the episode itself, I wasn't really setting out to do any kind of exhaustive overview of all the studies that have been done on parrot cognition. It's a huge subject, as you know. I think I might have mentioned in the episode that you could teach an entire course about. So definitely, my aim was not and is not to be very exhaustive in covering that subject. However, I thought that there have been a number of studies that came out since then that are interesting to mention. So I'm going to briefly talk about them here. So pictured on this slide are two different studies on cockatoos, in fact, different species of cockatoos. On the left-hand side is pictured a sulfur-crested cockatoo, a species from Australia, opening a bin in somebody's backyard, probably. Yeah, so it turns out that a number of sulfur-crested cockatoos have learned to open bins to look for, well, food inside those bins, so garbage, namely. Yeah, it is quite interesting that in North America we're used to raccoons perhaps raiding bins, whereas in Australia they have these cockatoos doing it. So yeah, for us it seems pretty exotic, but yeah, all depends on your perspective, like what kind of wildlife you consider to be quote unquote normal. Now, this study basically looked at not only the fact that this behavior exists, but what they did was that they basically surveyed, residents in Australian neighborhoods over a course of 2 years, and they to see, when and where people were observing this kind of behavior from cockatoos. And what they found was that it seems that there is some evidence that cockatoos are not only learning how to do, this kind of behavior, how to find food in rubbish bins, but also learning it by observing other cockatoos. Because what they found was that it seems that cockatoos from different regions of Australia have different preferences for how to open the bins. Like some of them will mostly open it using their beak, others will use both their foot and their beak, and so on. There are several different methods that they use to do this, and it seems that these methods vary by region. And they also suggest that based on analyzing, the timing of these observations that they gathered, that it seems likely that these behaviors have been spreading over time across different regions, and kind of the most likely reason for this spread is cultural kind of spread, transmission within these cockatoos. So these cockatoos are probably learning how to do this from other cockatoos. Like, maybe may or may not be directly taught by other cockatoos, but certainly from observing other cockatoos, they might be learning how to do this. And so they presented evidence for the bin opening behavior and its cultural spread in this species. So that's pretty cool that these birds have this culture and are socially learning from one another. On the right-hand side here is a different species of cockatoo called the Tannenbar corella, also called the Goffin's cockatoo. I actually talked about this species quite a lot in the episode because a lot of experiments have recently been done looking at tool use in this species. So you might remember some of them. Like I mentioned how there was this puzzle box that they had to do like several different steps to open, and people have found that some individuals of this species were able to figure out like this kind of multi-step process just from exploring the puzzle box or from observing other members of their species. There also was an experiment where they looked at how cockatoos would modify pipe cleaners to get food out of test tubes or other setups like that. So they basically gave the cockatoos these pipe cleaners and these food inside test tubes and tried to observe what they did. And it turns out the cockatoos would modify the pipe cleaners according to how they would help them obtain the food. But all of these studies were done in captive settings. So this new study, what they did was they actually went and observed the species of cockatoo out in the wild and decided to try and figure out, do these cockatoos use tools in the wild, and what kind of tools do they use in the wild, and what do they use these tools for? And what they observed was that some individuals of this cockatoo in the wild did indeed use tools, and not only that, they use several different types of tools in order to feed on a particular type of fruit called the sea mango. Now, this type of fruit, I think, according to the news articles I read, is apparently poisonous to humans. So yeah, we don't like to eat that kind of fruit, despite the name mango. But it does seem to be quite edible to these cockatoos. And what they would do is that the pit of the sea mango is like very hard. This type of cockatoo, the tannenbar corilla, is a relatively small species that probably isn't able to like open the pit of the sea mango with just its beak alone. But in order to get at the seeds inside and the pulp inside that pit, it turns out that some individuals of this species of cockatoo have figured out a way to do it. And so what they would do is first they would kind of rip pieces off, or they would break branches off trees to make these stout, sturdy tools, as pictured on the leftmost side here. And then they would insert these tools into a crack, the kind of a pre-existing crevice that was already present in the pit of these sea mangoes. And then they would wedge the tool in such a manner to kind of widen that crack. So that's the main function of this kind of a sturdy tool that they would make by breaking off branches. And then following that, they would use two other types of tools to try and get at the food that was inside the pits. So they would like split off pieces of bark from trees, and then they would use these very fine tools that were very sharp. So they would insert these tools into the crack that they made, and then they would pierce open kind of this outer covering that was still covering the seeds inside the pit. So they would use these fine tools to do that, and then they would break off they would split off these medium length tools, and they would use these tools as almost like a spoon almost. So they would kind of shuffle these tools from side to side within the crack they had made, and that they had already punctured the outer covering of. And then by kind of sliding the tool back and forth through the crevice, they would be able to scoop out kind of a lot of the pulp and the seeds that were inside the pit there. And so finally, after doing this step, they would be able to extract the edible part of the pit from the inside, and then finally get a good meal out of it. So yeah, this is an incredible study that shows that yes, not only do these birds have very complex kind of tool making and tool using skills in the wild, but also that they will make different types of tools to fit with different steps in this particular kind of behavior, depending on the function that they need to perform. So yeah, amazing study, and they were able to kind of collect some of the tools that these birds abandoned after they were done with them, and kind of analyze whether there was any significance to the shapes and sizes of these tools. And they found basically, yeah, there indeed was. Like, they did consistently use these sturdy tools for one function, and the fine tools for another, and the medium-sized tools for another. And so yeah, amazing study, and yet again shows just how smart some of these birds are. Do you have anything to add about these couple of studies?
That latter one is like incredible to me.
Yeah.
Just the sheer precision of these different tool uses for
Mm-hmm.
different needs. That's like, I don't like to do these sorts of comparisons, but
Yeah.
that's almost like primate levels of
Right.
cognition there. Like, that's, wow, that's so cool.
Yeah, definitely. I'm with you there, and yeah, definitely on par with like the complexity that we have observed in primates. Now, there are a couple more studies. So on the next slide, both of these studies were done on Kia. I think we did talk about Kia as well. These are very
Yeah.
inquisitive species of parrot from New Zealand, and yeah, also very well known for being very intelligent, and sometimes because of that intelligence, causing trouble for people because they like to play with items, and in doing so, often destroying items that people find valuable or useful. So yeah, sometimes coming into conflict with people because of it. But in any case, because of their intelligence, they are also been very heavily studied in terms of their cognitive abilities in recent years. And so here are a couple more studies that have tried to learn more about that. So one of these studies was done on particular individual Kia. So this was a captive Kia that is named, I think he's named Bruce, and he's missing, as you can see in the photo here, most of his upper bill. So he actually can't, he actually has trouble doing a lot of the things that a normal Kia would do. Things like preening and feeding, for example, are actually quite difficult for him. However, he is still able to use and manipulate objects. What he does is he uses his tongue and his lower jaw to kind of hold on to things, and that's what's pictured in the image here. That's his tongue on the top, and he uses it to hold objects against his lower bill, and in doing so he can hold objects to kind of investigate them or use them as tools, as it turns out, because what this study was describing was that it turns out that he would perform a particular kind of tool use to make up for his disability here. As mentioned, he can't really preen his feathers very well because he's missing his upper beak. However, what he would do when he wanted to preen was that he would pick up pebbles, and not just any pebbles, but pebbles of a specific kind of size, and then he would, pick these pebbles up in the manner that he's picking up this, dark object here. So he would pick up pebbles of a certain size and then kind of rub them against his feathers and run them through his feathers, and in doing so he would kind of clean his feathers in much the same way that he would if he did have a complete beak. The authors made many observations of this, and they found that he would only pick up these pebbles when he wanted to preen. He would only use pebbles and not any other kind of object for this purpose, and he would consistently choose like a specific size of pebble, not just any pebbles. And so all of these combined seem to suggest a very intentional kind of use of these pebbles as tools, and specifically because he has this disability is why he's using these tools to kind of make up for that. So that is definitely a very fascinating study. The second study, of which a setup is kind of pictured on the right here, is a more general study, not done like on a specific individual Kia, but on like several Kia in general, to try and understand how Kia perceive virtual objects. So objects are shown on, like, say, a computer screen, but aren't like physically present. So this kind of study has been done on like human infants, for example, and it turns out that at about 19 months old, at least, human infants already recognize kind of virtual objects on a screen as being like different from like physical objects in like that are physically actually present. So they decided to do an experiment to find out whether or not Kia made this kind of distinction as well. And it turns out, so what they did was that first they would basically deposit a token on an actual, a token that was placed on an actual seesaw that's shown on the top here, and then you place the token on the seesaw, and the seesaw would deposit the token into one of these boxes on to either side, and then the Kia were trained to choose whichever box had the token in it. Okay. The Kia got to observe a virtual version of the setup, so there's no, the token and the seesaw and the boxes are not physically present, but they're all shown on the screen here. But they showed the token dropping into one of these virtual boxes, and then they would choose accordingly as well. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. And then what they would show the Kia on the kind of final panel here was a virtual seesaw depositing a virtual token, but with boxes that were physically present here. Whether the Kia would treat these any different, even though these were real boxes and a combination of real boxes and a virtual seesaw. And it turns out that that doesn't, they don't seem to distinguish the virtual setting from the real setting in any way. They still seem to choose as they would, regardless of any of whether it was a virtual setup or a real setup or a combination of both. So that's a way in which Kia seem to be different from human infants, in that they don't seem to make this kind of distinction. And they also ran one more study where they would alternate between like a physical setup and a virtual setup, and see if the Kia would choose any differently between those. And yeah, it seems that for most part they didn't seem to, and so it seems that Kia perceive a virtual setup as essentially the same as a real physical setup, and that has implications for not only what we know about parrot cognition, but also how we can study it. Because if the parrots, or at least the Kia in this case, seem to perceive the virtual setup and the physical setup as the same, that means we can probably use like virtual setups and then extrapolate to what a Kia would do with a physical setup as well. So that kind of opens up some possibilities for studying their cognition. So yeah, there are these two different studies on Kia, which are in many ways, pretty different kind of focuses from one another, but they both tell us something pretty interesting about how these animals see the world and behave. So, do you have anything else to add to this?
I just have like one major question,
Yeah,
because that screen experiment is really fascinating.
yeah.
Parrots haven't passed the mirror test yet, have they?
Yeah, not that we know of. Yeah, no, I don't think anybody has reported, like in the scientific literature at least, that that's been the case. Yeah.
Okay, so I was curious, like if that might be linked to this here, like that's just not a faculty that they have.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, yeah, that could well be related. Yeah, I know there's been some evidence of self-awareness, like passing the mirror test in corvids, in
Mm.
magpie specifically. Although that is a somewhat controversial study because the individuals use the sample size used is quite small, and I think
Right.
the individuals, the birds that were used in that study were like captive specimens that were like very familiar with mirrors and such. And so yeah, people have pointed out that yeah, maybe the results can't really be extrapolated to all members of the species, but even so, yeah, it is notable that parrots haven't really had any kind of equivalent to that yet. So yeah.
Right. Yeah, I guess that is kind of like the thing about the mirror test, because I know
Right.
like there was that one study a few years back with manta rays, but again,
Yes.
it was only like one population in a captive setting
Right.
that this test was subjected to. They didn't bother like going out into the wild where
Hmm.
manta rays are and attempt that. Of course, then it's like, how would you be able to?
Yeah.
Um, because they can kind of go wherever they want. They're big enough
Right.
to do so. Okay, yeah. But I mean, if anything, like mirror test or not, I mean, clearly parrots are still something truly special as far as cognition is concerned among
Hmm.
birds.
Yeah, definitely, definitely, and yeah, it kind of drives home the kind of the point you sort of alluded to earlier, like why we shouldn't really be like comparing these animals, like which one is like smarter than the other, because
Mm,
animals can be good at very different kinds of skills, like even under the umbrella of cognition. Like some animals are better at some things than others, like but not necessarily at all skills across the board. So yeah, I think it's definitely something we have to keep in mind that these animals might have different types of cognition, but not necessarily better or like or worse than the others yeah, overall. So yeah. Um, in any case, I think that's the last of the studies that I've decided to cover in this updates episode. Hope everybody enjoyed. Certainly, as you can see, that science moves very quickly. Like in just a year or so that we've been doing these episodes, there have already been some pretty major changes to some of the material that I presented in the episodes that we recorded. So if you enjoyed this episode or enjoy the show in general, please consider supporting us on Patreon, which we have now. Your support will help us be able to focus more on doing work for the show, making new episodes, and also content related to the show, such as the website that we very much are still working on. And at the moment, we currently have two patrons in total, one of whom is scheduled for a shout out in every episode, and that is Joan's sister, Julie. And so thanks a lot to all of our patrons for their support. It really helps us out a lot. And thank you, all of you who are listening as well, just for all of your support and viewership, because that also means a lot to us. And
mm,
in addition to that, we would like to thank our friends Henry and Alicia for their regular contributions to our episode. Henry came up with the theme music, and Alicia came up with the color scheme for my avatar. So, yeah, all of those are quite integral parts of our episodes, and so they wouldn't be the way they are without them. And finally, you if you're on Twitter, you may follow us at Time and Clades. We will post updates whenever we release new episodes. If you haven't subscribed to us yet on our YouTube channel and want to, feel free to do that. Certainly, you'll be able to keep up with our new episodes most directly in that way. And if you have questions about anything that we discussed on this episode, you may email us at timeandclades@gmail.com. We kind of regret to say that we haven't been staying on top of our email very consistently. However, we haven't really gotten many emails to begin with in the first place. Yeah. However, we will try to make an effort to check in more often in the future, and we have, as far as I know, responded to all the queries that we did get in the recent kind of time period. Now, you may also kind of leave a comment on our videos here. We do keep our comments open, and we would like to continue to keep them open. So yeah, feel free to do that as long as you're not being disruptive. And as always, we will put links in the description to all of the studies that we talked about in this episode. And with that, we will see you next time. As far as I know, probably our next episode will be our next monthly news update. So stay tuned for that. But I wouldn't put it past us to do additional releases since we're not really bound to a strict kind of series anymore. We are kind of free to release what and whenever we want. So yeah, in any case, subscribe to our channel and you will be notified whenever we do anything on here. All right, so please take care, everybody. Hope you stay safe, and see you next time.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.